The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Read by Ian Richardson. To the magnificent Lorenzo de Piero de' Medici. Those who strive to win the favour of a prince usually bestow upon him gifts they consider most precious, or which they see him take most delight in. So one often sees horses, arms, cloth of gold, precious stones, and similar ornaments presented to princes according to their greatness. Desiring, therefore, to present myself to your magnificence with some testimony of my devotion to you, I have not found among my possessions anything which I hold more dear nor value so much as the knowledge of the actions of great men, acquired by long experience in contemporary affairs, and a continual study of ancient history, which, having reflected upon it with great and prolonged diligence, I now send, digested into a little volume, to your magnificence. And although this work may not be worthy of your support, nevertheless I trust much to your kindness that it may be acceptable to you, seeing that it is not possible for me to make a better gift than to offer you the opportunity of understanding, in the shortest time, all that I have learnt in so many years, and with so many troubles and dangers. I have not embellished the work with swelling or magnificent words, nor stuffed it with inappropriate meanderings, nor with irrelevant attractions and adornments with which so many are accustomed to embellish their works, for I wish either that no merit shall be given it, or else that the truth of the matter and the weightiness of the theme shall make it satisfactory. Nor do I agree with those who regard it as presumption if a man of low and humble status dare to discuss and settle the concerns of princes, because just as those who draw landscapes place themselves below in the plain to contemplate the nature of the mountains and of lofty places, and in order to contemplate the plains, place themselves high upon the mountains, so to understand the nature of the people one must be a prince, and to understand the nature of princes, one must be one of the people. Take, then, your magnificence, this little gift in the spirit in which I send it, wherein, if it be diligently read and considered by you, you will learn my fervent desire that you should attain that greatness which fortune and your other attributes promise. And if your magnificence from the summit of your greatness will sometimes turn your eyes to these lower regions, you will see how undeservedly I have to endure a great and continuing misfortune. First chapter. How many kinds of principalities there are, and how they are acquired. All states and all powers that have held and hold sway over men have been and are either republics or principalities. Principalities are either hereditary, in which the family has been long established, or they are new. The new are either entirely new, as was Milan to Francesco Sforza, or they are, as it were, members annexed to the hereditary state of the prince who has acquired them, as was the kingdom of Naples to that of the King of Spain. Such dominions thus acquired are either accustomed to live under a prince or to live in freedom, and are acquired either by the arms of the prince himself or of others, or else by luck or by ability. Second chapter. Concerning hereditary principalities. I will leave out all discussion on republics, as I have written about them at length in another place, and will address myself only to principalities and discuss how such principalities are to be ruled and preserved. I say at once there are fewer problems in holding hereditary states, and those long accustomed to the family of their prince, than new ones, for it is only sufficient not to violate the customs of his ancestors and to deal prudently with circumstances as they arise, for a prince of average powers to maintain himself in his state, unless he be deprived of it by some extraordinary and excessive force, and if he should be so deprived of it, whenever anything sinister happens to the usurper, he will regain it. We have in Italy, for example, the Duke of Ferrara, who could not have withstood the attacks of the Venetians in 1484, nor those of Pope Julius in 1510, unless he had been long established in power, for the hereditary prince has less cause and less necessity to offend. Hence it happens that he will be more loved, and unless extraordinary vices cause him to be hated, it is reasonable to expect that his subjects will be naturally well disposed towards him, and in the duration of his rule the memories and motives that make for change are lost, for one change always leaves teething problems for another. Third chapter, concerning mixed principalities. The difficulties occur, however, in a new principality. Firstly, if it is not entirely new, but is, as it were, a member of a state which, taken collectively, may be called composite, the changes arise chiefly from an inherent difficulty in all new principalities. For men change their rulers willingly, hoping to better themselves, and this hope induces them to take up arms against the ruler. But they are deceived, because afterwards they discover from experience that they have gone from bad to worse. This follows also on another natural and common necessity, which always causes a new prince to burden his new subjects with the imposition of force and countless other hardships as a result of his acquisition. In this way you have enemies of all those whom you have injured in seizing that principality, and you are not able to keep those friends who put you there because you are not able to satisfy them in the way they expected, and you cannot take strong measures against them as you feel bound to them. But despite one being very strong in armed forces on entering a province, one always needs the goodwill of the local people. For these reasons, Louis XII, King of France, quickly occupied Milan and just as quickly lost it. And to turn him out the first time, it only needed Lodovico's own forces, because those who had opened the gates to him, finding themselves deceived in their hopes of future benefit, would not endure the ill treatment of the new prince. It is very true that after acquiring rebellious provinces a second time, they are not so likely lost afterwards, because the prince, with little reluctance, takes the opportunity of the rebellion to punish the rebels, clear out the suspects, and strengthen himself in the weakest places. Thus, to cause the King of France to lose Milan the first time, it was enough for the Duke Lodovico to raise insurrections on the borders. But to cause him to lose it a second time, it was necessary to bring the whole world against him, to defeat him and drive his armies out of Italy. Nevertheless, Milan was taken from France both the first and the second time. The general reasons for the first have been discussed. It just remains to name those for the second, and to see what resources they had and what anyone in his situation would have done to maintain his position more securely than the King of France. Now, I say that those dominions which are acquired and added to an existing state by the conqueror are either of the same country and language, or they are not. When they are, it is easier to hold them, especially when they have not been accustomed to self-government. And to hold them securely, it is enough to have destroyed the family of the prince who was ruling them at the time. Because the two peoples, having similar traditions and customs, will live quietly together, as has been seen in Brittany, Burgundy, Gascony, and Normandy, which have been part of France for so long a time. And although there may be some differences in language, nevertheless the customs are similar, and the people will easily be able to get on amongst themselves. He who has annexed them, if he wishes to hold them, has only to bear in mind two considerations. The one, that the family of their former lord is destroyed. The other, that neither their laws nor their taxes are altered, so that in a very short time the new principality will become one with the old. But when states are acquired in a country differing in language, customs, or laws, there are problems, and good luck and great energy are needed to hold them, and most importantly, he who has acquired them should go and live there. This would make his position more secure and durable, as it has made that of the Turk in Greece, who, notwithstanding all the other measures taken by him for holding that state, if he had not settled there, would not have been able to keep it. Because if one is on the spot, Disorders are seen as they spring up, and one can quickly deal with them. But if one is not at hand, they are heard of only when they have become serious, and by then it is too late. Besides this, the country was not conquered by your officials, and the subjects are only satisfied by prompt recourse to the prince himself. Thus, wishing to be good, they have more cause to love him, and wishing to be otherwise, to fear him. He who attacks that state from the outside must take the utmost caution. As long as the prince resides there, it can only be taken from him with the greatest difficulty. The other and better course is to send settlers to one or two places, which may then tether that state to you. It is necessary either to do that or instead keep there a great number of cavalry and infantry. A prince does not spend much on these colonies, for with little or no expense he can send them out and keep them there, and he offends only a minority of the citizens from whom he takes land and houses to give to the new inhabitants, and those whom he does offend, remaining poor and scattered, are never able to injure him, whilst the rest, being uninjured, are easily kept quiet, and at the same time are anxious not to cause offence for fear it should happen to them. In conclusion, I maintain that these settlers are not costly, they are more faithful, they injure less, and the injured, as I have said, can do no harm. Also, one has to mention that men should either be well treated or crushed, because, although they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, of more serious ones they cannot. Therefore, the harm that is done to a man should be so serious that one does not stand in fear of revenge. But in maintaining armed men there instead of settlers, one spends much more, having to expend on the garrison all the income from the state, so that the acquisition turns into a loss, and many more are exasperated because the whole state suffers. Through the manoeuvring of the army back and forth, everyone becomes acquainted with hardship and becomes hostile, and those who are beaten on their own ground are still able to cause damage. For every reason, therefore, such guards are as useless as colonization is useful. Again, the prince who holds a country differing in the above respects ought to make himself the head and defender of his less powerful neighbours, and to weaken the more powerful amongst them, taking care that no foreigner as powerful as himself shall by any accident gain a foothold there. For it will always happen that such a one will be introduced by those who are discontented, either through excess of ambition or through fear, as we have already seen. The Romans were brought into Greece by the Aetolians, and in every other country where they obtained a foothold, they were brought in by the local inhabitants. And the usual course of affairs is that as soon as a powerful foreigner enters a country, all the subject states are drawn to him, moved by the hatred which they feel against the ruling power. So that in respect to these weaker states he has no trouble at all in winning them over to himself, for they all quickly rally to the state which he has acquired there. He has only to take care that they do not get hold of too much power and too much authority, and then, with his own forces and with their goodwill, he can easily keep down the more powerful of them so as to remain entirely master of his country. And he who does not properly manage this business will soon lose what he has acquired, and while he is holding it, will have countless difficulties and troubles. The Romans, in the countries which they annexed, observed closely these measures. They sent colonies and maintained friendly relations with the minor powers, without increasing their strength. They kept down the more powerful, and did not allow any strong foreign powers to gain authority. Greece appears to me sufficient for an example. The Achaeans and the Aetolians were appeased by the Romans, the kingdom of Macedonia was crushed, Antiochus was driven out. Yet the Achaeans and the Aetolians were never allowed to increase their power, however friendly they were. Nor did Philip of Macedonia ever induce the Romans to be his allies without first being humbled by them. nor did Antiochus make them agree that he should retain any authority over the country. For the Romans did in these instances what all prudent princes ought to do, who have to face not only present troubles but future ones as well, for which they must prepare with every energy, because, if foreseen, they can easily be remedied. But if you wait until they approach you, the medicine is no longer in time, because the malady has become incurable. For it happens in this, as the physicians say of a wasting disease, that in the beginning the illness is easy to cure but difficult to detect. Yet in the course of time, not having been either detected or treated in the beginning, it becomes easy to detect but difficult to cure. Thus it happens in affairs of state. For when the evils that arise have been foreseen, which it is only given to a wise man to see, they can quickly be redressed. But when, not having been foreseen, they have been permitted to grow in such a way that everyone can now see them, there is no longer a remedy. Therefore the Romans, foreseeing the troubles, dealt with them at once, and even to avoid a war, would not let them come to a head, for they knew that war is not to be avoided but merely put off to the advantage of others. Also, they wished to fight with Philip and Antiochus in Greece, so as not to have to do it in Italy. They could have avoided both, but did not wish to. Nor were they ever tempted to follow the advice of wise men of the time who said, "Let us enjoy the benefits of the time," but preferred the benefits of their own valour and prudence. For time drives everything before it, and brings with it good as well as evil, and evil as well as good. But let us turn to France, and see whether she has done any of the things mentioned. I will speak of Louis, and not of Charles, as the one whose conduct is the better to observe, having held possession of Italy for the longest period, and you will see that he has done the opposite to that which ought to be done to maintain power in a foreign territory. King Louis was brought into Italy by the ambition of the Venetians, who desired to obtain half the state of Lombardy by his intervention. I will not blame the course taken by the king, because, wishing to get a foothold in Italy and having no friends there, seeing rather that every door was shut to him owing to the conduct of Charles, he was forced to accept those friendships he could get, and would have succeeded very quickly if he had not made some mistakes in other matters. The king, however, having acquired Lombardy, regained at once the authority which Charles had lost. Genoa yielded. The Florentines became his friends, the Marquis of Mantua, the Duke of Ferrara, the Bentivogli, my Lady of Forli, the lords of Faenza, of Pesaro, of Rimini, of Camarino, of Piombino, the Lucchesi, the Pisans, and the Sienese. Everybody made advances to him to become his friends. Then the Venetians realized how rash they had been. In order to secure just 2 towns in Lombardy, they had made the king master of 2/3 of Italy. Let anyone now consider with what little difficulty the king could have maintained his position in Italy had he observed the rules and kept all his friends secure and protected. For although they were numerous, they were both weak and timid, some afraid of the church, some of the Venetians, and thus they would always have been forced to stand in with him, and by their means he could easily have made himself secure against those who remained powerful. But he was no sooner in Milan than he did the contrary by assisting Pope Alexander to occupy the Romagna. It never occurred to him that by this action he was weakening himself, depriving himself of friends and of those who had thrown themselves into his lap, whilst elevating the church by adding much temporal power to the spiritual, thus giving it greater authority, and having committed this prime error, he was obliged to follow it up, so much so that to put an end to the ambition of Alexander, and to prevent his becoming the master of Tuscany, he was himself forced to come into Italy. And as if it were not enough to have increased the power of the church and deprived himself of friends, he, wishing to have the kingdom of Naples, divides it with the king of Spain, and where once he was the prime arbiter of Italy, takes an associate to whom the ambitions of that country and the malcontents of his own could have recourse. And whereas he could have left in the kingdom his own pensioner as king, he drove him out, to put one there who was then able to drive himself out in turn. The wish to acquire is, in truth, very natural and common, and men always do so when they can, and for this they will be praised, not blamed. But when they cannot do so, yet wish to do so by any means, then there is folly and blame. Therefore, if France could have attacked Naples with her own forces, she ought to have done so. If she could not, then she ought not to have divided it. And if the partition which she made with the Venetians and Lombardy was justified by the excuse that by doing so she got a foothold in Italy, this other partition merited blame because it did not have the same excuse. Therefore, Louis made these 5 errors. He destroyed the minor powers. He increased the strength of one of the greater powers in Italy. He brought in a foreign power. He did not settle in the country. He did not send colonies. Such errors, if he had lived, were not enough to injure him had he not made a 6th, by taking away their dominions from the Venetians. Because had he not empowered the Church, nor brought Spain into Italy, it would have been very reasonable and necessary to crush the Venetians. But having first taken these steps, he ought not to have consented to their ruin, for they, being powerful, would always have kept off others from designs on Lombardy, to which the Venetians would never have consented except to become masters themselves there. Also because the others would not wish to take Lombardy from France in order to give it to the Venetians, and they would not have had the courage to defy both. And if anyone should say, King Louis yielded the Romagna to Alexander and the kingdom to Spain to avoid war, I answer, for the reasons I have given, that a blunder ought never to be perpetrated to avoid war, because it is not to be avoided, only deferred to your disadvantage. And if anyone should cite the king's good faith pledged to the Pope that he would assist him in the enterprise in exchange for the dissolution of his marriage and for the cap to the Archbishop of Rouen, to that I reply that I shall write later on concerning the faith of princes and how it ought to be kept. Thus King Louis lost Lombardy by not having followed any of the conditions observed by those who have taken possession of countries and wish to retain them. Nor is there any miracle in this, but much that is reasonable and quite natural. On these matters I spoke at Nantes with Cardinal Rouen, when Valentino, as Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander was usually called, occupied the Romagna. And on Rouen observing to me that the Italians did not understand war, I replied to him that the French did not understand government, meaning that otherwise they would not have allowed the Church to reach such greatness. And in fact it has been seen that the dominance of the Church and of Spain in Italy was caused by France, and France's ruin in turn may be attributed to them. From this a general rule is concluded which never or rarely fails, that he who is the cause of another becoming powerful is himself ruined, because that predominancy has been brought about either by cunning or by force. Both are distrusted by the one who has been brought to power. 4th chapter. Why the kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander, did not rebel against the successors of Alexander at his death. Considering the difficulties which men have had to hold a newly acquired state, some might wonder how, seeing that Alexander the Great became the master of Asia within a few years and died whilst it was yet scarcely settled, upon which it might appear reasonable that the whole empire would have rebelled, nevertheless his successors retained power, and had to meet no other problems than that which rose among themselves, resulting from their own ambitions. I reply that all principalities throughout history are found to be governed in 2 different ways, either by a prince with a body of servants who assist him to govern the kingdom with his favour and permission, or by a prince and barons who hold their rank by blood and are not appointed by the prince. Such barons have states and their own subjects, who recognize them as lords and hold them in natural affection. Those states that are governed by a prince and his servants hold their prince in higher esteem, because in all the country there is no one who is recognized as superior to him, and if they yield obedience to another, they do it as to a minister and official, and they do not bear him any particular loyalty. The examples of these two governments in our time are the Turk and the King of France. The entire monarchy of the Turk is governed by one lord, the others are his servants, and, dividing his kingdom into sanyaks or districts, he sends there different administrators and shifts and changes them as he chooses. But the King of France is placed in the midst of an ancient body of lords, acknowledged by their own subjects and beloved by them. They have their own prerogatives, and the king cannot take these away except at his peril. Therefore, he who considers both of these states will recognize great difficulties in seizing the state of the Turk, but, once it is conquered, great ease in holding it. The causes of the difficulties in seizing the kingdom of the Turk are that the usurper cannot be called in by the princes of the kingdom, nor can he hope to be assisted by the rebellion of those closest to the Lord. This arises from the reasons given. For his ministers, being all slaves and bondmen, can only be corrupted with great difficulty, and one can expect little advantage from them when they have been corrupted, as they cannot carry the people with them, for the reason stated. Hence, he who attacks the Turk must bear in mind that he will find him united, and he will have to rely more on his own strength than on the revolt of others. But if once the Turk has been conquered and routed in the field so that he cannot replace his armies, there is nothing to fear but the family of the prince, and they having been exterminated, there remains no one to fear, the others having no credit with the people. And as the conqueror did not rely on them before his victory, so he ought not to fear them after it. The contrary happens in kingdoms governed like that of France, because one can easily enter there by winning over some baron of the kingdom, for one always finds malcontents and those who desire a change. Such men, for the reasons given, can open the way into the state and render the victory easy. But if you wish to hold it afterwards, you meet with infinite difficulties, both from those who have assisted you and from those you have crushed. Nor is it enough for you to have wiped out the family of the prince, because the lords that remain make themselves the heads of new factions against you, and as you are unable either to appease or exterminate them, that state is lost as soon as the opportunity presents itself. Now, if you will consider what was the nature of the government of Darius, you will find it similar to the kingdom of the Turk, and therefore it was only necessary for Alexander first to overthrow him in the field, and then to take the country from him, after which victory, Darius being killed, the state remained secure to Alexander. And if his successors had been united, they would have enjoyed it securely and at their ease, for there were no uprisings in the kingdom, except those they provoked themselves. But it is impossible to hold, with such tranquillity, states constituted like that of France. Hence arose those frequent rebellions against the Romans in Spain, France, and Greece, owing to the many principalities there had been in these states, which, while the memory of these principalities remained, the Romans were always unsure of their ability to hold. But with the power and longevity of the empire, the memory of them lapsed, and the Romans then became secure possessors. And afterwards, when they began fighting amongst themselves, each one was able to attach to himself his own parts of the country according to the authority he had assumed there, and the family of the former lord, having been exterminated, none other than the Romans were acknowledged. When these things are remembered, no one will marvel at the ease with which Alexander held the empire of Asia, or at the problems which others have had to hold on to an acquisition such as Pyrrhus and many more. This is not marked by the extent of the victor's ability, but by the lack of uniformity within the vanquished state. Fifth chapter. concerning the way to govern cities or principalities which lived under their own laws before they were annexed. Whenever those states, newly acquired, as I said, have been used to living under their own laws and in freedom, there are three courses for those who wish to hold them. The first is to ruin them. The second is to reside there in person, and the third is to permit them to live under their own laws, gaining their confidence and establishing within it an oligarchy which will keep it friendly to you. Because such a government being created by the prince, and knowing that it cannot stand without his friendship and interest, does its utmost to support him, and therefore a city accustomed to freedom can be held more easily through its own citizens than in any other way. There are, for example, the Spartans and the Romans. The Spartans held Athens and Thebes, establishing there an oligarchy. Nevertheless, they lost them. The Romans, in order to hold Capua, Carthage, and Numantia, dismantled them and did not lose them. They wished to hold Greece as the Spartans held it, freely and under its own laws, but did not succeed. So, to hold it, they were compelled to dismantle many cities in the country, for in truth, there is no safe way to retain them other than by ruining them. And he who becomes master of a city used to freedom and does not destroy it may expect to be destroyed by it, for in rebellion it has always been the watchword of liberty and its ancient privileges as a rallying point, which neither time nor the benefits from the new ruler allow it to forget. And whatever you may do or provide against, they never forget that name or their privileges unless they are disunited or scattered. Instead, at every chance, they will immediately rally to them, as Pisa did after the 100 years she had been held in bondage by the Florentines. But when cities or countries are used to living under a prince, and his family is annihilated, they, being on the one hand accustomed to obey, and on the other hand not having the old prince, cannot agree in choosing one from amongst themselves, and do not know how to govern themselves. For this reason they are very slow to take up arms, and a prince can win them over and hold them much more easily. But in republics there is more vitality, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance, which will never allow them to forget their former freedom, so that the safest way is to destroy them, or to take up residence there. Sixth chapter, concerning new principalities which are acquired by one's own arms and ability. Let no one be surprised if, in speaking of entirely new principalities as I shall do, I cite as evidence the highest examples both of prince and of state, because men, walking almost always in paths trodden by others, and following by imitation their deeds, are unable exactly to emulate the ways of others, nor attain to the power of their exemplary models. A wise man should always follow the paths trodden by great men, and imitate those who have been supreme, so that if his ability does not equal theirs, at least it will have an air of greatness. Let him act like the clever archers, who, designing to hit the mark which still appears far too distant, and knowing the limitations of their bow, take aim much higher than the mark, not in order to reach so great a height, but to be able with the aid of so high an aim to reach the target. I say, therefore, that in entirely new principalities where there is a new prince, more or less difficulty is found in holding them, according to the more or less ability of the new ruler. Now, as the fact of becoming a prince from a private person presupposes either ability or luck, it is clear that one or the other of these two things will mitigate in some degree many difficulties. However, he who has relied least on luck is established the strongest. Further, it facilitates matters when the prince, having no other state, is compelled to live there in person. But to come to those who by their own ability, and not through luck, have risen to be princes, I say that Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and such like, are the most excellent examples. And although one may not discuss Moses, he having been a mere executor of the will of God, he ought to be admired if only for that favour which made him worthy to speak with God. But in considering Cyrus and others who have acquired or founded kingdoms, all will be found admirable. And if their particular deeds and conduct shall be considered, they will not be found inferior to those of Moses, although he had so great a mentor. And in examining their actions and lives, one cannot see that they owed anything to luck beyond opportunity, which brought them the material to mould into the form which seemed best to them. Without that opportunity, their prowess would have been extinguished, and without that prowess, the opportunity would have been lost. It was necessary, therefore, to Moses that he should find the Israelites in Egypt enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians, in order that they should follow him so as to be delivered out of slavery. It was necessary that Romulus should not remain in Alba, and that he should be abandoned at his birth, in order that he should become king of Rome and founder of the fatherland. It was necessary that Cyrus should find the Persians discontented with the government of the Medes, and the Medes soft and effeminate through their long peace. Theseus could not have shown his ability had he not found the Athenians dispersed. These opportunities, therefore, made those men fortunate, and their high ability enabled them to recognize the opportunity whereby their countries became renowned and prosperous. Those who become princes, like these men, acquire a principality with difficulty, but they keep it with ease. The difficulties they have in acquiring it arise in part from the new rules and methods by which they are forced to introduce to establish their government and its security. And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to initiate changes in a state's constitution, because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in innovations until they have had a long experience of them. Thus it happens that whenever those who are hostile have the opportunity to attack, they do it vigorously, whilst the others defend half-heartedly, in such a way that the prince is endangered along with his friends. It is necessary, therefore, if we desire to discuss this matter thoroughly, to inquire whether these innovators can rely on themselves or have to depend on others. That is to say, whether to achieve their purposes they use persuasion or force. In the first instance, they always succeed badly and never attain anything. But when they can rely on themselves and use force, then they are rarely endangered. Hence it is that all armed prophets have conquered, and the unarmed ones have been destroyed. Besides the reasons mentioned, the nature of the people is variable, and whilst it is easy to persuade them, it is difficult to confirm them in that persuasion, and thus it is necessary to take such measures that, when they believe no longer, they can be made to believe by force. If Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus had been unarmed, they could not have enforced their constitutions for long, as happened in our time to Fra Girolamo Savonarola, who was ruined with his new constitution immediately the people no longer believed in him. And he had no means of maintaining the loyalty of those who believed, nor of making the unbelievers believe. Therefore they have great difficulties in achieving their goal, for all their dangers are in the ascent, yet with ability they will overcome them. But when these are overcome, and those who envied them their success are exterminated, they will begin to be respected, and they will continue afterwards powerful, secure, honored, and happy. To these great examples, I wish to add a lesser one. It is Hiero the Syracusan. This man rose from a private citizen to be prince of Syracuse, He owed nothing to luck except opportunity, for the Syracusans, being oppressed, chose him for their captain, and afterwards he was rewarded by being made their prince. He was of so great ability, even as a private citizen, that one who writes of him says he wanted nothing but a kingdom of which to be king. This man disbanded the old militia, organized a new one, gave up old alliances, made new ones, and as he had his own soldiers and allies, he was able to build on such foundations any edifice. Thus, whilst he had endured much trouble in acquiring, he had but little in keeping. 7th chapter. Concerning new principalities which are acquired either by the arms of others or by good fortune. Those who solely by good fortune become princes from being private citizens have little trouble in rising, but much in staying at the top. They have no difficulties on the way up because they fly, but they have many when they reach the summit. Such are those to whom a state is given either for money or as a favour from he who donates it, as happened to many in Greece, in the cities of Ionia and of the Hellespont, where princes were made by Darius in order that they might hold the cities both for his security and his glory. And also were those emperors who, from being citizens, came to be rulers by virtue of corruption amongst the soldiers. Such stand simply upon the goodwill and the fortune of the man who has elevated them, two most inconstant and unstable things. Neither have they the requisite knowledge for the position, because unless they are men of great worth and ability, it is unreasonable to expect that they should know how to command, having always lived as a private individual. Besides, they cannot hold their position because they do not have the forces which they can keep friendly and loyal. Regimes that appear overnight, like all other things in nature which are born and grow rapidly, lack the foundations and roots necessary to overcome the first storm they encounter, unless those who suddenly become princes are men of so much ability that they know they have to be prepared at once to hold what fortune has thrown into their laps, and that those foundations which others have laid before they became princes they must relay afterwards. Concerning these two methods of rising to be a prince by ability or fortune, I wish to cite two examples within our own recollection, and these are Francesco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. Francesco, by proper means and with great ability, from being a private citizen, rose to be Duke of Milan. What he had acquired with endless struggles, he kept with little trouble. On the other hand, Cesare Borgia, called by the people Duke Valentino, acquired his state during the ascendancy of his father, and, on its decline, he lost it, even though he had taken every precaution, and done all that should be done by a wise and able man, to fix his roots firmly in the states which he had won by the arms and fortunes of others. Because, as I said before, he who has not first laid his foundations may be able with great ability to lay them afterwards, but they will be laid with trouble to the architect and danger to the building. If, therefore, all steps taken by the Duke are considered, it will be seen that he laid solid foundations for his future power, and I consider it necessary to discuss them because I do not know what better guidelines to give a new prince than the example of Cesare's actions, and if his efforts were to no avail, that was not his fault, but extreme misfortune. Alexander VI, in wishing to give more power to Duke Valentino his son, had many immediate difficulties. Firstly, he did not see a way of making him master of any state unless it was a state of the Church, and if he were to seize a state of the Church, he knew that the Duke of Milan and the Venetians would not consent, because Faenza and Rimini were already under the protection of the Venetians. Besides this, he saw the armed forces of Italy, especially those which may have assisted him, controlled by those who would fear a more powerful pope, namely the Orsini and the Colonnesi and their following. It was therefore necessary for him to upset this state of affairs and throw these powers into turmoil, so as to make himself securely master of part of the states. This was easy for him to do because he found the Venetians, moved by other reasons, inclined to bring back the French into Italy. Not only would he not oppose this, he would make it easier by dissolving the former marriage of King Louis. So the French king invaded Italy with the assistance of the Venetians and the consent of Alexander, and he was no sooner in Milan than the Pope had soldiers from him for the attempt on the Romagna, which yielded to the Pope because of the standing of the king. The Duke Valentino, therefore, having acquired the Romagna and beaten the Colonnesi, while wishing to hold that and to advance further, was hindered by two things. The one, his forces did not appear loyal to him. The other, the goodwill of France. That is to say, he feared that the forces of the Orsini, which he was using, would not stand by him, and not only might they hinder him from winning more, but might themselves seize what he had won, and the king might also do the same. He did have a warning about the Orsini when, after taking Faenza and attacking Bologna, he saw that they were very loath to attack. And as for the king, the Duke Valentino realized what was in his mind when he himself, after taking the Duchy of Urbino, attacked Tuscany, and the king called him off. Hence, the Duke decided to depend no more upon the arms and the luck of others. Firstly, he weakened the Orsini and the Colonnesi parties in Rome by gaining for himself all their supporters who were gentlemen, making them his gentlemen, giving them good pay and, according to their rank, honouring them with office and command in such a way that in a few months all hostile factions were destroyed and had turned entirely to himself. After this, he waited for an opportunity to crush the Orsini, having scattered the supporters of the Colonna house. This opportunity came soon, and he used it well, for the Orsini, realizing at last that the increased power of the Duke and the Church was ruin to them, called a meeting at Magione in Perugia. From this sprung the rebellion at Urbino and the uprisings in Romagna, with endless dangers to the Duke Valentino, all of which he overcame with the help of the French. Having restored his authority, and not putting it at risk by trusting either to the French or other outside forces, he resorted to cunning. Through the mediation of Signor Paolo, whom the Duke did not fail to secure with all kinds of attention, giving him money, apparel, and horses, the Orsini were reconciled, so that their simplicity brought them into his hands at Senigallia. Having exterminated the leaders and turned their partisans into his friends, the Duke Valentino had laid a sufficiently strong power base, having all the Romagna and the Duchy of Urbino, and the people, now beginning to appreciate their prosperity, were won over by him. And as this point is worthy of notice, and to be imitated by others, I am not willing to leave it out. When the Duke Valentino occupied the Romagna, he found it under the rule of weak masters, who preferred to pillage their subjects rather than rule them, and gave them more cause for revolt than for harmony, so that the country was full of robbery, quarrels, and every kind of violence. And so, wishing to bring back peace and obedience to authority, he considered it necessary to give it a good governor. So he promoted Messer Ramiro d'Orco, a swift and cruel man, to whom he gave the fullest power. This man, in a short time, restored peace and unity with great success. Afterwards, the Duke Valentino considered that it was inadvisable to confer such excessive authority, for he had no doubt that Ramiro would abuse his power. So he set up a court of judgment in the country under a most excellent president, on which every city had a representative. And because he knew that the past severity had caused some hatred against himself, so to clear himself in the minds of the people and to win them over entirely to himself, he wanted to show that if any cruelty had been practiced, it had not originated with him, but in the natural sternness of Ramiro. Under this pretence, he took the governor, and one morning had him executed and left him on the piazza at Cesena, with the block and a bloody knife at his side. The barbarity of this spectacle caused the people to be both satisfied and upset. But let us return to where we started. I say that the Duke, finding himself now sufficiently powerful and partly secure from immediate dangers by having armed himself in his own way, and having in a great measure crushed those forces in his vicinity that could injure him, if he wished to proceed with his conquest, had next to consider France. For he knew that the king, who too late was aware of his mistake, would not support him. So Duke Valentino began to seek new alliances, and to avoid siding with France in the expedition which he was making towards the kingdom of Naples against the Spaniards who were besieging Gaeta. It was his intention to secure Spanish support, and he would have succeeded quickly had Alexander lived. Those were the Duke's plans for the immediate future. Beyond that, he had to fear, in the first place, that a new successor to the Church might not be friendly to him, and might seek to take from him the powers Alexander had given him. So he decided to act in 4 ways. Firstly, by exterminating the families of those lords whom he had deprived. Secondly, by winning over all the gentlemen of Rome so as to curb the Pope with their help, as I mentioned previously. Thirdly, by controlling the College of Cardinals as far as he could. Fourthly, by acquiring so much power before Alexander died that he could, on his own, resist the first attack. Of these 4 things, at the death of Alexander, he had accomplished 3. For he had killed as many of the dispossessed lords as he could lay hands on, and few had escaped. He had won over the Roman gentlemen, and he had the largest party in the College of Cardinals. And as to any fresh acquisition, he intended to become master of Tuscany, for he already possessed Perugia and Piombino, and Pisa was under his protection. And as he no longer had to respect France, for the French were already driven out of the kingdom of Naples by the Spaniards, and in this way both were compelled to buy his goodwill, he pounced down upon Pisa. After this, Lucca and Siena yielded at once, partly through hatred and partly through fear of the Florentines, and the Florentines would have had no remedy had he continued to prosper as he was prospering the year that Alexander died, for he had acquired so much power and reputation that he would have stood by himself, and no longer have depended on the luck and the forces of others, but solely on his own power and ability. But Alexander died 5 years after the Duke Valentino had first taken up the sword. He left the Duke with the state of Romagna alone consolidated, with the rest up in the air between 2 most powerful hostile armies, and sick unto death. Yet there were in the Duke such boldness and ability, and he knew so well how men are to be won or lost, and so firm were the foundations which in so short a time he had laid, that if he had not had those armies on his back, or if he had been in good health, he would have overcome all difficulties. And it is seen that his foundations were good, for the Romagna waited for him for over a month. In Rome, although but half alive, he remained secure, and whilst the Baglioni, the Vitelli, and the Orsini might come to Rome, they could rouse no one against him. If he could not install whom he wished Pope, at least he could prevent the papacy going to someone he did not want. But if he had been in sound health at the death of Alexander, everything would have been easy for him. On the day that Julius II was elected, he told me that he had thought of everything that might occur at the death of his father, and had provided a remedy for all, except that he had never anticipated that when the death did happen, he himself would be on the point of dying. When all the actions of the Duke Valentino are recalled, I do not know how to blame him, but rather it appears to me, as I have said, that I ought to offer him for imitation to all those who, by the fortune or the arms of others, are raised to government. Because Cesare, having a lofty spirit and far-reaching aims, could not have regulated his conduct otherwise, and only the shortness of the life of Alexander and his own sickness frustrated his plans. Therefore, he who considers it necessary to secure himself in his new principality, to win friends, to overcome either by force or fraud, to make himself beloved and feared by the people, to be followed and revered by the soldiers, to exterminate those who have power or reason to hurt him, to change the old order of things for new, to be severe and gracious, magnanimous and liberal, to destroy disloyal troops and to create new armies, to maintain friendships with kings and princes in such a way that they must help him with zeal and offend with caution, cannot find a more lively example than the actions of this man. However, he can be blamed for the election of Julius II, in whom he made a bad choice, because, as I said, not being able to elect a pope of his own choosing, he could have hindered any other from being elected pope, and he ought never to have consented to the election of any cardinal whom he had injured, or who had cause to fear him, for men injure either from fear or hatred. Those whom he had injured, among others, were San Pietro ad Vincula, Colonna, San Giorgio, and Ascanio. The rest, in becoming pope, had to fear him, Rouen and the Spaniards excepted, the latter on account of their friendship and obligations, the former on account of his influence, the Kingdom of France having good relations with him. Therefore, above everything, the Duke Valentino ought to have created a Spanish pope, and failing him, he ought to have consented to Rouen, and not San Pietro ad Vincula. He who believes that new benefits will cause great people to forget old injuries is deceived. Therefore, the Duke Valentino erred in his choice, and it was the cause of his ultimate ruin. 8th chapter. Concerning those who have obtained a principality through crime. Although a prince may rise from a private citizen in two ways, neither of which can be entirely attributed to good fortune or genius, it is clear to me that I must not leave either of them out, although one could be more copiously treated when I discuss republics. These methods are when one ascends to power in a principality either by some evil or nefarious way, or when a private citizen becomes the ruler of his country by the favour of his fellow citizens. Speaking of the first method, it will be illustrated by two examples, one ancient, the other modern. And without going further into the subject, I consider these two examples enough for those who may have to follow them. Agathocles, the Sicilian, became king of Syracuse not only from a private but also from a low position. This man, the son of a potter, through all the changes in his fortunes, always led an infamous life. Nevertheless, he combined his infamies with so much ability of mind and body that, having devoted himself to the military, he rose through its ranks to be commander of Syracuse. Being established in that position, and having deliberately resolved to make himself prince and to seize by violence, without obligation to others, that which had been voluntarily conceded to him, he came to an understanding for this purpose with Hamilcar the Carthaginian, who, with his army, was fighting in Sicily. One morning he assembled the people and senate of Syracuse, as if he had to discuss with them matters relating to the Republic, and at a given signal the soldiers killed all the senators and the richest of the people. These dead, he seized and held the princedom of that city without any civil commotion. And although he was twice routed by the Carthaginians and ultimately besieged, not only was he able to defend his city, but leaving part of his men for its defence, he attacked Africa with the others, and in a short time had put down the siege of Syracuse. The Carthaginians, reduced to dire straits, were compelled to come to terms with Agathocles, and leaving Sicily to him, had to be content with the possession of Africa. Therefore, he who considers the actions and the genius of this man will see nothing or little which can be attributed to fortune, inasmuch as he attained preeminence, as is shown, not by the favour of anyone, but step by step in the military profession, which steps were gained with 1,000 troubles and perils, and were afterwards boldly held by him with many hazards and dangers. Yet it cannot be called ability to slay fellow citizens, to deceive friends, to be without faith, without mercy, without religion. Such methods may gain empire, but not glory. Still, if one considers the courage of Agathocles in entering into and extricating himself from dangers, together with his greatness of mind in enduring and overcoming hardships, I cannot see why he should be esteemed less than the most notable captain. However, his barbarous cruelty and inhumanity with infinite wickedness do not permit him to be celebrated among the most excellent men. What he achieved cannot be attributed either to fortune or to genius. In our times, during the rule of Alexander VI, Oliverotto da Fermo, having been left an orphan many years before, was brought up by his maternal uncle Giovanni Fogliani, and in the early days of his youth was sent to fight under Paolo Vitelli, so that, after training under him, he could attain some high position in the military. After Paolo died, he fought under Paolo's brother Vitellozzo, and in a very short time, being endowed with wit and a vigorous body and mind, he soon became Vitellozzo's chief commander. But, not wishing to serve under others, he resolved, with the aid of some citizens of Fermo, to whom the slavery of their country was dearer than its liberty, and with the help of the Vitelleschi, to seize Fermo itself. So Oliverotto wrote to Giovanni Fogliani, informing him that, having been away from home for many years, he wished to visit him and his city, and in some measure to look into his own estates, and although he had not laboured to acquire anything except honour, yet, in order that the citizens should see he had not spent his time in vain, he desired to return home honourably, and would be accompanied by 100 horsemen, his friends and retainers, and he entreated Giovanni to arrange for him to be received with honour by the Firmans, all of which would not only add to his own glory, but also to that of Giovanni himself, who had brought him up. Giovanni, therefore, did not let his nephew down, and caused him to be honourably received, and put him up in his own house. Having passed some days, and having prepared what was necessary for his wicked plans, Oliverotto gave a solemn banquet, to which he invited Giovanni Fogliani and the chiefs of Fermo. When the food and all the other entertainments that are usual in such feasts were finished, Oliverotto artfully embarked on a serious speech on the greatness of Pope Alexander and his son Cesare, and on their achievements, to which Giovanni and others answered. But then Oliverotto rose up, saying that such matters ought to be discussed in a more private place, and he went into another room. Giovanni and the rest of the citizens went in after him. No sooner were they seated than soldiers appeared from secret places and slaughtered Giovanni and the rest. After these murders, Oliverotto, mounted on horseback, rode up and down the town and besieged the chief magistrate and the palace, so that in fear the people were forced to obey him, and to form a government of which he made himself the prince. He killed all the malcontents who could have injured him, and strengthened himself with new civil and military ordinances in such a way that, in the year during which he held the principality, not only was he secure in the city of Fermo, but he had become formidable to all his neighbours. And his destruction would have been as difficult as that of Agathocles if he had not allowed himself to be overreached by Cesare Borgia, who took him with the Orsini and Vitelli at Sinigalia, as I told before. Thus, 1 year after he had committed this parricide, he was strangled, together with Vitellozzo, whom he had made his leader in respect for his courage and evil. Some may wonder how it can happen that Agathocles and his like, after infinite treacheries and cruelties, should live a long and secure life in his country, defend himself from external enemies, and never be conspired against by his own citizens, seeing that many others have never been able, even in peaceful times, to hold the state by means of cruelty, still less in the doubtful times of war. I believe that it is a question of cruelty used well or badly. Those may be called well used, if one can talk this way of evil, when they are applied at once and are necessary for one's security, and are not persisted in afterwards unless for the good of one's subjects. The badly used are those which, although they may be few in the beginning, increase with time rather than decrease. Those who practice the first method are able, by the aid of God or man, to consolidate their position, as Agathocles did. It is impossible, however, for those who follow the other method to maintain power. So it must be noted that in seizing a state, the usurper ought to examine closely all those injuries which it is necessary for him to inflict, and to do them all at one stroke, so as not to have to repeat them daily, and thus, by not unsettling men, he will be able to reassure them and win them over by benefits. He who does otherwise, either from timidity or evil advice, is always compelled to keep a knife in his hand. Neither can he rely on his subjects, nor can they attach themselves to him, owing to their continued and repeated wrongs. For harm ought to be administered at one time, so that afterwards, the less often it happens, the quicker people forget. Benefits ought to be conceded gradually, so that the flavour of them may last longer. And above all things, a prince ought to live amongst his people in such a way that no unexpected circumstances, whether of good or evil, shall make him change. Because if the necessity for change comes in troubled times, you are too late for harsh measures, and mild ones will not help you, for they will be considered as forced out of you, and no one will be under any obligation to you on account of them. 9th chapter, concerning a civil principality. But coming to the other case where a leading citizen becomes the prince of his country, not by wickedness or any intolerable violence, but by the favour of his fellow citizens, this may be called a civil principality. Neither genius nor good fortune are necessary to attain it, but rather a lucky shrewdness. I say then that, in this case, one becomes a prince either through the favour of the people or the nobles. In all cities, these two distinct classes are to be found, and from this it is apparent that the people do not wish to be ruled nor oppressed by the nobility, but the nobles wish to rule and oppress the people. And from these two opposite extremes there arises in cities one of three results, either a principality, self-government, or anarchy. A principality is created either by the people or by the nobles, according to which of them has the opportunity. For the nobles, seeing they cannot withstand the people, begin to promote the reputation of one of themselves, and they make him a prince, so that under his shadow they can achieve their own ambitions. The people, finding they are unable to resist the nobles, also proclaim the reputation of one of themselves and make him a prince in order to be protected by his authority. He who obtains sovereignty by the assistance of the nobles maintains his position with more difficulty than he who comes to it with the help of the people, because the former finds himself with many around him who consider themselves his equals, and because of this he can neither rule nor control them to his liking, whereas he who reaches sovereignty by popular favour finds himself alone, and has none around him, or few, who are prepared to disobey him. Besides this, one cannot by fair dealing and without hurting others satisfy the nobles. But you can satisfy the people, for their object is more righteous than that of the nobles, the latter wishing to oppress, whilst the former's only wish is not to be oppressed. It must be added also that a prince can never secure himself against a hostile people because of their numbers, whilst he can secure himself from the nobles as there are fewer of them. The worst a prince may expect from a hostile people is to be abandoned by them. But from hostile nobles he has not only to fear abandonment, but also that they will rise up against him. For they, being far-seeing and astute, always come forward in time to protect their own interests and side with the one they expect will win. Further, the prince has to live always with the same people, but not the same nobles, since he can promote or demote them in a day, and give or take away authority as it pleases him. Therefore, to make this point clearer, I say that the nobles ought to be looked at mainly in two ways. That is to say, they either choose to conduct themselves in such a way that makes them dependent upon your fortunes, or they do not. Those who are so dependent, and are not greedy, should be honoured and loved. Those who are independent of you are so for two different reasons, through pusillanimity and a natural cowardice, in which case you ought to make use of them, especially those who give good advice. Consequently, in prosperity they respect you, and in adversity you have nothing to fear from them. But those who, for their own ambitious ends, retain their independence, show that they give more thought to themselves than to you, and a prince must guard against this, and fear them as if they were declared enemies, because in times of adversity they will always help to ruin him. Therefore, one who becomes a prince through the favour of the people must work to retain their loyalty, and this he can easily do because all they ask is not to be oppressed by him. But one who, against the wishes of the people, becomes a prince by the favour of the nobles, ought above everything seek to win the people over to himself, and this he may easily do if he takes them under his protection. Because men, when they receive kindness from someone of whom they were expecting the worst, are bound more closely to their benefactor. So the people quickly become more devoted to him than if he had been raised to the principality by their own favours. And the prince can win their affections in many ways, but as these vary according to the circumstances, I shall omit them. However, I shall repeat, it is necessary for a prince to gain the allegiance of the people, otherwise he has no security in adversity. Nabis, prince of the Spartans, withstood the attack of all Greece, and of a victorious Roman army, and against them he successfully defended both his country and his government. All he had to do when danger threatened was to take steps against a few, but this would not have been enough if the people had been hostile. And do not let anyone contradict this statement with the trite proverb, "He who builds on the people builds on mud." For this is true when a private citizen makes a base amongst the people and presumes that they will free him when he is in danger from his enemies or the magistrates. In those circumstances he would find himself very often deceived, as happened to the Gracchi in Rome and to Messer Giorgio Scali in Florence. But a prince who has established himself as above, who can command and is a man of courage, undismayed in adversity, who does not fail in other qualifications, and who by his resolution and energy retains the confidence of his people, such a prince will never be deceived, because he has laid his foundations well. These principalities are liable to danger when they are passing from the civil to the absolute order of government, for such princes either rule personally or through magistrates. In the latter case their government is weaker and more insecure, because it rests entirely on the goodwill of those citizens who have become magistrates and who, especially in troubled times, can destroy the government with great ease, either by intrigue or open defiance. And the prince has not the chance to exercise absolute authority because the people, accustomed to receiving orders from magistrates, are not of a mind to obey him amid these confusions, and there will always be, in difficult times, a scarcity of men whom he can trust. So a prince cannot rely upon his experiences of quiet times, when citizens need his government and everyone agrees with him. They all promise, and when death is a long way off, they all want to die for him. But in troubled times, when the state has need of the people, then he finds very few. This test of loyalty is all the more dangerous, as it can only be tried once. Therefore, a wise prince ought to adopt such a course of action that will ensure his citizens will always be dependent on the state and on himself, for then they will always remain faithful.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
10th chapter, concerning the way in which the power of all principalities ought to be measured. It is necessary to consider another point in examining the character of these principalities, that is, whether a prince has such power that in case of need he can support himself with his own resources, or whether he always needs the assistance of others. And to make this quite clear, I say that I consider those able to support themselves by their own resources are those who can, either with sufficient men or money, raise a large enough army to join battle against any aggressor. And I consider those always in need of others are those who cannot show themselves against the enemy in the field, but are forced to defend themselves by sheltering behind walls. The first case has been discussed, but we will speak of it again should it arise. In the second case, one can say nothing except to encourage such princes to strengthen and fortify their towns and not worry about the surrounding country. And whoever shall fortify his town well and shall have managed the concerns of his subjects in the way stated will never be attacked without great caution, for men are always adverse to tackling things where difficulties are evident, and it will be seen that it is not easy to attack one who has his town well fortified and has the support of his people. The cities of Germany are absolutely free. They own little country around them, and they yield obedience to the emperor when it suits them. They do not fear this or any other power they may have near them, because they are fortified in such a way that everyone thinks that taking them by assault would be too difficult, as they have proper ditches and walls, sufficient artillery, and always store in public depots enough for 1 year's eating, drinking, and firing. And beyond this, to keep the people quiet and without loss to the state, they always have the means of giving work to the community in those areas essential for the life and strength of the city, and in pursuit of which the people are supportive. Military exercises also are always popular, and there are many laws upholding them. Therefore, a prince who has a strong city and has not made himself unpopular will not be attacked, and if anyone should attack, he will only be driven off with disgrace. Again, because the affairs of this world are so changeable, it is almost impossible to keep an army in the field for a whole year without being interfered with, and whoever should reply, "If the people have property outside the city and see it burnt, they will not remain loyal, and the long siege and self-interest will make them forget their prince," to this I answer that a powerful and courageous prince will overcome all these difficulties by giving at one time assurance to his subjects that the evil will not be for long, and at another time instilling upon them fear of the enemy's cruelty, and taking effective measures against those who are too outspoken. Further, the enemy would naturally, upon arrival, burn and ruin the country at the time when the spirits of the people are fired with enthusiasm and ready for defence, and therefore there is little time for the prince to lose, because after a time when emotions have cooled, the damage is already done, the ills are incurred, and there is no longer any remedy. Subsequently, they are so much the more ready to unite with their prince, he being obligated to them now that their houses have been burnt and their possessions ruined while defending him. For it is the nature of men to be as much bound by the benefits they confer as by those they receive. Therefore, if everything is well considered, it will not be difficult for a wise prince to keep the loyalty and respect of his citizens from the beginning to the end of the siege, so long as he can adequately provide for them and defend them. 11th chapter, concerning ecclesiastical principalities. It now remains to speak of ecclesiastical principalities, touching on all the difficulties prior to getting possession, because they are acquired either by ability or good fortune, but they can be held without either. They are sustained by the ancient ordinances of religion, which are all-powerful, and are such that the principalities may be held no matter how their princes behave and live. These princes alone have states and do not defend them, and have subjects and do not rule them, and the states, although unguarded, are not taken from them, and their subjects, though not ruled, do not care, and have neither the desire nor the ability to rise up against them. Such principalities only are secure and happy. But as they are upheld by powers incomprehensible to the human mind, I shall speak no more of them, because, being exalted and maintained by God, it would be the act of a presumptuous and rash man to discuss them. Nevertheless, if anyone should ask of me how it is that the Church has attained such greatness in temporal power, seeing that up to the time of Alexander the Italian potentates, not only those who have been called potentates, but every baron and lord, even the smallest, have valued the temporal power at next to nothing, Yet now a king of France trembles before it, and it has been able to drive him from Italy and also ruin the Venetians. I shall recount to some extent how it happened, even though the story is well known. Before Charles, King of France, passed into Italy, this country was under the rule of the Pope, the Venetians, the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines. These potentates had two principal anxieties. One, that no foreigner should enter Italy under arms. Secondly, that no one power amongst themselves should seize more territory. Those who needed watching were the Pope and the Venetians. To restrain the Venetians, the union of all the others was necessary, as it was for the defence of Ferrara, and to keep down the Pope, they made use of the barons of Rome, who, being divided into two factions, Orsini and Colonnesi, always had a pretext for dissension between them, and while remaining armed under the eyes of the pontiff, kept the papacy weak and powerless. And although there might arise a courageous pope like Sixtus, neither good fortune nor wisdom could rid even him of these problems. And the short life of a pope is also a cause of weakness, for in the 10 years, which is the average life of a pope, he can with difficulty crush just one of these factions, and if one pope should almost destroy the Colonnesi, another would arise hostile to the Orsini and supportive of the Colonnesi, and yet would not have time to ruin the Orsini. This was the reason why the temporal powers of the pope were held in low esteem in Italy. Then came the reign of Alexander VI, who, of all the pontiffs that have ever lived, showed how much a pope with both money and arms could achieve, and by using Duke Valentino, also called Cesare Borgia, as his means, and because the invasion of the French, he brought about all those things I have discussed in the actions of the Duke. And although his intention was to make the Duke, not the Church, more powerful, Alexander's actions, in fact, contributed to the greatness of the Church and the ruin of the Duke. Pope Julius came next and found the Church strong, possessing all the Romagna, the barons of Rome reduced to impotence, and, through the punishments of Alexander, the factions wiped out. He also found the way open to accumulate money in a manner such as never been practised before Alexander's time. Julius not only followed but improved matters. He intended to win Bologna, to ruin the Venetians, and to drive the French out of Italy. All of these enterprises were successful, and he earned all the more credit because he did everything to strengthen the Church and not any one individual. He also kept the Orsini and Colonnesi factions within the bounds in which he found them, and although there were troublemakers amongst them, two things held them in check. One, the greatness of the Church, with which he terrified them, and the other, not allowing them to have their own cardinals, who caused disturbances among them. For whenever these factions have their cardinals, they do not remain quiet for long, because cardinals foster the factions both in and out of Rome, and the barons are compelled to support them. Thus, from the ambitions of prelates arise revolts among the barons. For these reasons, His Holiness Pope Leo found the pontificate most powerful, and it is to be hoped that if his predecessors established power by force, he will make it still more powerful and more venerated by his goodness and countless other virtues. 12th chapter. How many kinds of soldiery there are, and concerning mercenaries. Having discussed in detail the characteristics of such principalities, and having considered in some degree the causes of their being good or bad, and having shown the methods by which many have sought to acquire them and to hold them, it now remains for me to discuss generally the methods of their offence and defence. We have seen how necessary it is for a prince to have a strong power base, otherwise inevitably he will go to ruin. The essential ingredients of a well-run state, new as well as old or composite, are good laws and a good army. And as you cannot have good laws when the state is not well armed, so when they are well armed, they have good laws. I shall therefore leave the laws out of the discussion, and concentrate on arms. I say that the arms with which a prince defends his state are either his own, or are mercenaries, auxiliaries, or a mixture. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, and if a prince rules his state based on these soldiers of fortune, he will never achieve stability. They are disunited, ambitious, and without discipline, unfaithful, valiant before friends and cowardly before enemies. They have neither the fear of God nor the loyalty to men, and they delay destruction only so long as they avoid the battle. In peacetime one is robbed by them, and in war by the enemy. The fact is, they have no other attraction or reason for fighting than their paltry pay, which is insufficient to make them willing to die for you. They are ready enough to be your soldiers in peacetime, but if war comes, they turn their back on the enemy. I have little trouble in proving that the ruin of Italy has been caused by nothing else than by resting all her hopes for many years on mercenaries. And although they initially showed some prowess and appeared brave amongst themselves, when the foreigners came they showed themselves for what they really were. Thus Charles, King of France, was allowed to seize Italy with little resistance, and he who told us that our sins were the root cause of it was correct, but they were not the sins he imagined, but those which I have just mentioned. And as they were the sins of princes, it is the princes who have to suffer the penalty. I wish to demonstrate further the disloyalty of these soldiers of fortune. The mercenary captains are either capable men or they are not. If they are, you cannot trust them, because they always aspire to their own greatness, either by conspiring against you, their employer, or by destroying the enemy more thoroughly than is necessary. But if the captain is not skilful, you are ruined anyway. And if someone argues that this will apply to any armed force, mercenary or not, I reply that when arms have to be resorted to either by a prince or a republic, then the prince ought to take control as captain of his troops. The republic has to send its people, and when one is appointed commander but does not turn out satisfactorily, he should be recalled. And when one is good, he should be compelled by law to remain in command. And experience has shown that princes and republics single-handed make the greatest progress, and mercenaries do nothing except damage. And it is more difficult for a republic with its own army to be subjugated by one of its own people than a republic whose forces are made up of foreign mercenaries. Rome and Sparta stood for many centuries armed and free. The Swiss are also completely armed and free. Of the ancient mercenaries, for example, there are the Carthaginians, who were subjugated by their mercenary soldiers after the first war with the Romans, despite the Carthaginians having their own people as captains. And after the death of Epaminondas, Philip of Macedon was made captain of their soldiers by the Thebans, and after his victory he robbed them of their freedom. After Duke Filippo's death, the Milanese enlisted Francesco Sforza against the Venetians, and he, having overcome the enemy at Caravaggio, allied himself with the Venetians to crush his masters, the Milanese. His father, Sforza, having been engaged by Queen Joanna of Naples, deserted her, so that she was forced to throw herself at the mercy of the King of Aragon in order to save her kingdom. Admittedly, the Venetians and Florentines had previously extended their dominions by use of mercenary forces whose captains had defended them and not seized the state. But my reply is that the Florentines in this case were favoured by luck, for of the able captains who might have caused them problems, the one who failed militarily was Giovanni Acuto, and since he was not a success, his loyalty cannot be proved. But everyone will acknowledge that had he succeeded, the Florentines would have been under his power. Sforza had the Bracceschi always against him, so they cancelled each other out. Francesco turned his ambition to Lombardy, and Braccio against the Church and the Kingdom of Naples. But let us now come to what happened just a short time ago. The Florentines appointed as their captain Pagolo Vitelli, a most prudent man, who from a private position had risen to the greatest heights. If this man had taken Pisa, nobody can deny that it would have been essential for the Florentines to keep in with him, for if he became commander of their enemies, they would have no means of resisting, and if they stuck with him, they would have to obey him. The Venetians, if their achievements are considered, will be seen to have acted safely and gloriously so long as they sent to war their own men. when with armed officers and other ranks they did valiantly. This was before they campaigned on land, when they forsook this virtue and followed the military traditions of Italy. And in the beginning of their expansion on land, through not having much territory and because of their great reputation, they had not much to fear from their captains. But when they expanded, as under Carmignuola, they made a serious mistake, for, having found him a most courageous man, they beat the Duke of Milan under his leadership, and, on the other hand, knowing how lukewarm he had become to the war, they feared they could no longer conquer under him. They were not willing to dismiss Carmignola in case they lost again what they had recently acquired, so they were compelled, for safety's sake, to murder him. Afterwards they had as captains Bartolomeo de Bergamo, Roberto da San Severino, the Count of Pitigliano, and the like, under whom they experienced enough difficulty just holding on to what they had, let alone making any gains, the result being that afterwards at Veia they lost in one battle what had taken them 800 years and considerable trouble to acquire. Because mercenaries bring victory only slowly, long delayed, and feeble, the losses are sudden and colossal. And so, with these examples, I have reached Italy, which has been ruled for many years by mercenaries. I wish to discuss them more fully, in order that, having seen their rise and progress, you may be better prepared to counteract them. You must understand that Italy has repudiated the empire so that the Pope has acquired more temporal power, and Italy has herself been divided up into more states, the reason being that many of the great cities took up arms against their nobles who, formerly favoured by the emperor, had been oppressing them, and at the same time the Church was supporting them so as to gain authority in temporal power. In many other cities, one of their citizens became prince. Thus Italy fell partly into the hands of the Church and partly into the hands of republics. Now the Church consisted of priests and the republics of citizens, both unaccustomed to the use of arms. So both started to enlist foreigners. The first who gave renown to this soldiery was Alberigo da Conio, the Romanian. From the school of this man sprang, among others, Braccio and Sforza, who in their time were the masters of Italy. After these came all the other mercenaries who till now had been in control of Italian forces. The result of all their achievements has been that Italy has been overrun by Charles, plundered by Louis, assaulted by Ferdinand, and outraged by the Swiss. The principle that has guided the mercenaries has been, first, to discredit the infantry, so that they might increase their own troops. They did this because, subsisting on their pay and without territory, they were unable to support many soldiers, and a few infantry did not give them any authority. So they were led to employ cavalry, with a moderate force of which they were maintained and honoured. The result was that in an army of 20,000 soldiers there were hardly 2,000 foot soldiers. They had, besides this, used every effort to lessen fatigue and danger to themselves and their soldiers. Instead of fighting to the death, they took prisoners and liberated them without even a ransom. They did not attack towns at night, nor did the garrisons of the towns attack encampments at night. They did not surround the camp either with stockade or ditch, nor did they campaign in the winter. All these things were permitted by their military code, and devised by them to avoid, as I have said, both exertion and danger. Thus the mercenaries have brought Italy to slavery and ignominy. 13th chapter. Concerning auxiliaries, mixed soldiery, and one's own forces. Auxiliaries, which are the other useless arm, are employed when a prince is called in with his forces to aid and defend, as was done by Pope Julius in recent times. For in the campaign against Ferrara he had first-hand knowledge of the lack of ability of his mercenaries, so turned to auxiliaries, and agreed with Ferdinand, King of Spain, for his assistance with men and arms. These auxiliaries may be useful and good in themselves, but for whoever calls them in they are always a disaster, for you are either left in the lurch if they are defeated, or are in their power if they achieve victory. and although ancient history may be full of examples, I do not wish to leave this recent one of Pope Julius II, the dangers of which cannot fail to be noticed. For he, wishing to take Ferrara, threw himself entirely into the hands of a foreigner. But such was his good fortune that another event occurred, and he did not suffer the damage of his rash choice, because his auxiliaries, being routed at Ravenna, and the Swiss having risen and driven out the victors against all expectations, Julius did not become prisoner of his enemies, they having fled, nor of his own auxiliaries, since he had conquered with other forces, not theirs. The Florentines, being entirely without an army, sent 10,000 Frenchmen to take Pisa, thus taking a greater risk than at any other time of their troubles. The Emperor of Constantinople, to oppose his neighbours, sent 10,000 Turks into Greece, who, on the ending of the war, were unwilling to leave. This marked the beginning of the subjection of Greece to the infidels. Therefore, let he who does not wish to conquer make use of these auxiliaries, for they are much more dangerous than mercenaries. They are all united, yet owe an allegiance to others, whereas mercenaries, when they have conquered, need more time and better opportunity to do you harm. Auxiliaries are not all of one community. They are found and paid by you, and a third party, which you have made their head, is not able immediately to assume enough power to harm you. In conclusion, in mercenaries, cowardice is most dangerous, but in auxiliaries, courage. The wise prince, therefore, has always avoided auxiliaries and turned to his own, and has preferred to lose with his own forces than conquer with others, not considering it a real victory if won with foreign forces. I shall never hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia, better known as Duke Valentino, and his actions. This duke entered the Romagna with auxiliaries, taking there only French soldiers, and with them he captured Imola and Forli. But afterwards these forces did not appear to be reliable, so he turned to mercenaries, discerning less danger in them, and enlisted the Orsini and Vitelli. But he soon found them to be doubtful, unfaithful, and dangerous, so he destroyed them, and turned to his own men. And the difference between one and the other of these forces can easily be seen by the difference there was in the reputation of Borgia. When he had the French, when he had the Orsini and Vitelli, and when he relied on his own soldiers, on whose loyalty he could always count and found ever increasing. He was never esteemed more highly than when everyone saw that he was complete master of his own forces. I was not intending to go beyond Italian and recent examples, but I would not wish to leave out Hiero the Syracusan, he being one of those I have already mentioned. This man was made head of the army by the Syracusans, and he soon discovered that a mercenary soldier, constituted like our Italian condottieri, was useless, and when it appeared to him that he could neither keep them nor let them go, he had them all cut to pieces, and afterwards fought using his own forces and not those made up of foreigners. I wish also to recall an instance from the Old Testament applicable to this subject. David offered himself to Saul to fight with Goliath, the Philistine champion, and to give him courage, Saul armed him with his own weapons. David, however, rejected them as soon as he had them on his back, saying he could not use them, and that he wished to fight Goliath with his sling and his knife. Charles VII, the father of King Louis XI, having both by good fortune and valour liberated France from the English, recognized the necessity of being armed with forces of his own people, and established in his kingdom a decree to recruit troops and infantry. Afterwards his son, King Louis, abolished the decree and began to enlist the Swiss. This mistake, followed by others, was, as can now be seen, a source of danger to that kingdom, because, having increased the reputation of the Swiss, he has entirely diminished the value of his own forces, for he has destroyed the infantry altogether, and his remaining troops he has subordinated to others, because, as they are so accustomed to fighting alongside the Swiss, it does not appear that they can now conquer without them. So it arises that the French cannot stand against the Swiss nor without them, hence they do badly against others. The armies of the French have thus become mixed, partly mercenary and partly national, and together they are a more powerful force than mercenaries alone or auxiliaries alone, although still inferior to one's own forces. And this example proves it, for the kingdom of France would be unconquerable if the decree of Charles had been enlarged or maintained. But the paltry wisdom of man on entering into a project which at first looks promising cannot discern the hidden poison within. Therefore, if he who rules a principality cannot recognize evils until they are upon him, he is not a truly wise man, and this insight is given to few. If the first downfall of the Roman Empire were to be examined, it would be found to have started only with the enlisting of the Goths as mercenaries, because from that time the empire began to decline, and all that power and valour which had established it passed to others. I conclude, therefore, that no principality is secure without having its own forces. On the contrary, it depends entirely on good fortune if it has neither the courage nor the loyalty which an adversity would defend it. And it has always been the opinion and judgment of wise men that nothing can be so uncertain or unstable as fame or power not based on its own strength. And one's own forces are those which comprise either one's subjects, citizens, or dependents. All others are mercenaries or auxiliaries, and the way to establish one's own forces will be easily found if the rules suggested by me are adhered to, and if you also consider how Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, and many republics and princes have armed and organized themselves. I willingly defer to their judgment and wisdom. 14th chapter. That which concerns a prince on the subject of the art of war. A prince ought to have no other aim or thought than war, its rules, and its discipline, for this is the sole art that is required of a ruler, and it is of such importance that it not only enables those who are born princes to maintain their rule, but often helps men to rise from an ordinary citizen to princely rank. And, on the other hand, it is seen that princes who have thought more of their pleasures than their arms have soon lost their states. And the first cause of your losing it is to neglect the art of war, and that which enabled you to acquire the state in the first place was to be a master of that art. Francesco Sforza, through being warlike, went from being a private citizen to becoming Duke of Milan, and his sons, through avoiding the hardships and troubles of arms, went from being dukes to private citizens. For amongst other evils, being unarmed causes you to be despised, and that is one of those ignominies against which a prince ought to guard, as is shown later on. Because there is no comparison between the armed and the unarmed, it is not reasonable that one who is armed should willingly obey one who is not, or that the unarmed man should be safe among armed servants. Because, there being in the one disdain and in the other suspicion, they cannot work well together. And therefore a prince who does not understand the skill of war, over and above the other misfortunes already mentioned, cannot be respected by his soldiers, nor can he rely on them. He ought therefore never to put out of his mind the subject of war, and in peace he should practice military exercises more often than in war. This he can do in two ways, the one by physical action, and the other by study. As regards action, he ought above all things to keep his men well organized and drilled, to hunt, to accustom his body to hardships, to learn something of the lie of the land and find out how the mountains rise, how the valleys open out, how the plains lie, to understand the nature of rivers and marshes, and in doing so take the greatest care. This knowledge is useful in two ways. Firstly, he learns to know his country and becomes more able to undertake its defence. Secondly, by means of his knowledge of the locality, he can easily understand any other which he may be required to assess in the future, because the hills, valleys, plains, rivers, and marshes that are, for instance, in Tuscany, have a certain resemblance to those of other countries, so that with a knowledge of the lie of one country one can easily arrive at a knowledge of others. And the prince that lacks this skill lacks the essential requirements a captain should possess, for it teaches him to surprise his enemy, to select headquarters, to lead armies, to plan his strategy, and to besiege towns successfully. Philopoemen, prince of the Achaeans, has been commended by historians because in time of peace he never had anything on his mind but the rules of war, and when he was in the country with his friends, he often stopped and reasoned with them. If the enemy should be upon that hill, and we should find ourselves here with our army, who would have the advantage? How should one best advance to meet him, keeping ranks? If we should wish to retreat, how ought we to go about it? If they should retreat, how should we pursue? And he would relate to them as he went all the opportunities that could befall an army. He would listen to their opinion and state his, confirming it with reasons, so that by these continual discussions he could prepare himself for every eventuality in war. But to exercise his intellect, the prince should read history and study the actions of illustrious men, to see how they have fared in war, to examine the causes of their victories and defeats, in order to avoid the latter and emulate the former, and above all, do as one distinguished man did, who took as an example someone who was famous before him and whose achievements and deeds he always kept in his mind, as Alexander the Great emulated Achilles, Caesar Alexander, and Scipio Cyrus, and whoever reads the life of Cyrus, written by Xenophon, will recognize afterwards in the life of Scipio how that emulation was his glory, and how in chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality Scipio modelled himself on Cyrus, as portrayed by Xenophon. A wise prince should observe these rules and never in peacetime stand idle, but spend his time in preparing to counter any adversity that may in future arise in the event that his luck may change. 15th chapter, concerning things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. It remains now to see how a prince should conduct himself towards his subjects and friends, and as I know many have written on this point, I expect I shall be considered presumptuous in mentioning it again, especially as in discussing it I shall draw up my own set of rules. But it being my intention to write something which will be useful to him who understands it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real rather than the imagined truth. For many have imagined republics and principalities which, in fact, they have never known or seen, because how one lives is so far removed from how one ought to live. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done brings about self-ruin instead of self-preservation. For a man who wishes to be entirely virtuous soon comes to grief amongst those not so virtuous. Hence it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong, and how to make use of this knowledge as and when he needs to. Therefore, leaving aside imaginary things and concentrating on reality, I say that all men, when they are spoken of, and especially princes who have a higher profile, are noted for some of those qualities which bring them either condemnation or praise. And so it is that some are reputed to be extravagant, others miserly, using a Tuscan term because an avaricious person in our language is still one who desires to possess by robbery, whilst we call one miserly who is mean to himself with what he possesses. One is reputed generous, one greedy, one cruel, one compassionate, one effeminate and cowardly, another bold and brave, one affable, another arrogant, one lascivious, another pure, one sincere, another devious, one hard, another easy, one serious, another frivolous, one religious, another unbelieving, and so on. And I know everyone will agree that it would be most laudable for a prince to exhibit all these qualities that are considered good. But human nature being what it is, he is not entirely infallible, though he must be sufficiently wise to know how to steer clear of those vices which would lose him his state, and also to avoid, if he can, the less dangerous vices, though he may indulge in these with less hesitation and without incurring reproach. For if everything is considered carefully, it will be found that something which appears to be virtuous, if followed, could be his ruin, whilst something else, which appears to be wicked, if followed, may bring him security and prosperity. 16th chapter, concerning generosity and meanness. Commencing with the first of these, I say that it would be splendid to have the reputation for generosity. But to be generous without gaining fame for it will harm you. For if one exercises it sincerely, as one should, it may pass unnoticed, and you will be thought of as mean. Therefore, anyone wishing to maintain among men a reputation for largesse is obliged to be lavish, so that a prince thus inclined will exhaust all his resources, and will be compelled in the end, if he wants to maintain his reputation, to burden his people with taxes and do everything he can to raise money. This will soon make him hated by his subjects, and becoming poor, he will be of little value to anyone. Thus, with his extravagance having offended many and rewarded few, he is vulnerable to the very first sign of trouble and brought to grief by the first real danger. When he realizes this and wishes to draw back from it, he then runs the risk of becoming miserly. Therefore a prince, not able to be generous except to his cost, if he is a wise man, he need not fear the reputation of being mean, for in time he will come to be considered bounteous, seeing that with a sound economy he can defend himself against attacks, and is able to engage in military campaigns without overtaxing his people. So it transpires that he is generous towards those from whom he does not take, who are numerous, and mean to those to whom he does not give, who are but few. We have not seen great things done in our time except by those who have been considered mean. The rest have failed. Pope Julius II was assisted in reaching the papacy by a reputation for generosity, yet he did not strive afterwards to keep it up, when he made war on the King of France. And he made many wars without imposing any extraordinary tax on his subjects, because he met his additional expenses out of his long periods of thriftiness. The present King of Spain would not have undertaken or conquered in so many campaigns if he had been reputed generous. A prince, therefore, if he does not have to tax his subjects in order to defend himself, if he does not become poor and abject, and if he is not forced to become greedy, should not worry about a reputation for meanness, for it is one of those vices which will enable him to govern. And if anyone should say, Caesar came to power by virtue of his generosity, and many others have reached the highest positions on the same account, I answer, either you are a prince or on your way to becoming one. In the first case, this generosity is dangerous. In the second, it is essential to be considered generous. And Caesar was one of those who wished to become preeminent in Rome. But if he had survived after becoming so, and had not moderated his expenditure, he would have destroyed his own government. And if anyone should reply, there have been many princes who have done great things with armies and who have been considered very generous, I say, either a prince spends his own money or other people's. In the first case, he ought to be sparing. In the second, he should not neglect any opportunity to be generous. And to the prince who goes forth with his army, maintaining it by pillage, sack, and extortion, and handling other people's possessions, this generosity is essential. Otherwise, he would not retain the support of his soldiers. And those things which are neither yours nor your subjects you can readily give away, as did Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander, because it does not diminish your reputation if you squander other people's resources, but enhances it. It is only squandering your own that will harm you. And nothing disappears so rapidly as generosity. For even whilst you exercise it, you are losing the ability to do so, and so become either poor or despised, or else, in avoiding poverty, avaricious and hated. And above all things, a prince should guard himself against being despised and hated, and generosity leads to both. Therefore it is wiser to have a reputation for meanness which brings disapproval without hatred, than to be compelled through seeking a reputation for generosity to incur a name for avarice which brings both disapproval and hatred. 17th chapter, concerning cruelty and compassion, and whether it is better to be loved than feared. Coming now to the other qualities mentioned, I maintain that every prince should want to be considered compassionate rather than cruel. Nevertheless, he ought to take care not to abuse this compassion. Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Nevertheless, his cruelty reconciled the Romagna, unified it, and restored it to peace and loyalty. And in actuality he will be seen to have been much more merciful than the Florentine people, who, to avoid a reputation for cruelty, permitted Pistoia to be devastated. Therefore a prince, so long as he keeps his subjects united and loyal, ought not to mind the reproach of cruelty, because with a few examples he will prove to be kinder than those who, through too much kindness, allow disorders to arise from which follow murders or robberies. For these may then harm all the people, whilst those executions which stem from the prince offend the individual only. And of all princes, it is impossible for the new prince to avoid the accusation of cruelty, owing to new states being full of dangers. Hence Virgil, through the mouth of Dido, excuses the inhumanity of her reign because of its newness, saying, Res dura et regni novitas metallia cogunt, miliri et late fines custode tueri. Or, against my will, my fate, a throne unsettled in an infant state, bid me defend my realms with all my powers, and guard with these severities my shores. Nevertheless, he ought to be slow to act, and should himself show no fear, but proceed in a temperate manner with prudence and humanity, so that too much confidence does not make him rash, and too much distrust render him unbearable. On this a question arises, whether it is better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Since in general men are ungrateful, fickle, cowardly, and avaricious, but as long as you are successful, they are yours entirely. They will shed blood for you, risk their property, life, and children when the danger is remote. But when it is close, they will turn against you. And the prince who, relying entirely on their promises, takes no other precautions, is ruined. Because friendships that are bought, rather than achieved by greatness or nobility of mind, may indeed be earned, but are not long-lasting, and in time of crisis cannot be relied upon. And men have less scruples in offending one who is loved than one who is feared. For love is preserved by a bond which, due to the failings of men, is broken at every opportunity to their advantage. But fear is strengthened by the dread of punishment, which is always effective. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that if he is not loved, at least he avoids hatred, because he can survive very well being feared and not hated, and this will continue as long as he leaves alone the property of his people and their women. But when it is necessary for him to execute someone, he must do it with proper justification and manifest reason, and above all he must keep his hands off the property of others, because men more quickly forget the death of their father than the loss of the inheritance. Besides, pretexts for confiscating property are always available, for he who has embarked on a life of crime will always find excuses for seizing other people's property, whereas reasons for execution are, on the contrary, more difficult to find and sustain. But when a prince is campaigning and is in command of large numbers of soldiers, he can disregard the reputation for cruelty, because without it he would never keep his army united and disciplined. Among the wonderful deeds of Hannibal, one is foremost. Having led an enormous army composed of many various races to fight in foreign lands, no dissensions arose either amongst his men or against him, whether things were going well or badly. This was partly because of his inhuman cruelty, and partly due to his limitless courage, which made him both revered and feared by his soldiers. But without that cruelty, his other virtues would have been insufficient to produce this effect. Short-sighted historians admire Hannibal's deeds from one point of view, but from another condemn the principal cause of them. That it is true his other virtues would not alone have been enough can be seen by the example of Scipio, a man unique during his own time and throughout history, but against whom his own army rebelled in Spain. This arose from nothing more than his excessive leniency, which gave his soldiers more license than is consistent with military discipline. For this he was reproached in the Senate by Fabius Maximus, and called the corrupter of the Roman legions. The Locri were plundered by one of Scipio's officers, yet they were not avenged, nor was the officer punished, owing largely to Scipio's easygoing nature. So much so that someone in the Senate, wishing to excuse him, said there were men who knew much better how not to go wrong than to correct the errors of others. This disposition, if Scipio had continued in command, would in time have destroyed his fame and glory. But he being under the control of the Senate, this harmful trait not only concealed itself, but contributed to his greatness. Returning to the question of being feared or loved, I have come to the conclusion that since men love as they please but fear according to the wishes of the prince, a wise prince should establish himself upon what he can control and not on what he cannot, and he must endeavour at all costs, as I said, to avoid hatred. 18th chapter, concerning the way in which princes should keep their word. Everyone acknowledges how praiseworthy it is in a prince to keep faith and to live with integrity and not with guile. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have achieved great things have regarded good faith as of little value, and have tricked men by deceit, and in the end have overcome those who have trusted them. You must know there are two ways of contending, the one by law, the other by force. The first method is natural to man, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently insufficient, it is essential to have recourse to the second. Therefore it is necessary for a prince to understand how to take advantage of the beast and the man. Princes have learnt this from the classical writers who describe how Achilles and many other ancient princes were given to the centaur Chiron to train in his own discipline, which means that, as they had for teacher a half-beast and half-man, so a prince learned how to make use of both natures, and that he cannot survive with one and not the other. A prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, should choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore the fox discovers the snares, and the lion terrifies the wolves. Those who rely simply on the lion do not understand this. A wise prince cannot, nor should he, keep his promise if it proves to be a disadvantage, and when the circumstances that gave rise to that promise no longer exist. If all men were good, this precept would not hold, but because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to keep your promises to them. Nor shall a prince ever lack good excuses for breaking his promise. Endless modern examples can be given, showing how many pacts and promises have been broken through the dishonesty of princes. And the prince, who knows best how to imitate the skills of the fox, comes off best. But he must know how to disguise this characteristic, and to be a great liar and hypocrite. Men are so simple, and so involved with their current problems, that he who wants to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. One recent example I must relate. Alexander VI did nothing else but deceive men, nor ever thought of doing otherwise, and was never short of victims, for there was never anyone who had more gravitas, or who could make greater promises, yet would inevitably break them. Nevertheless, his lies always succeeded as he wanted, because he understood this side of man's nature. Therefore, a prince must not only have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but also appear to have them. And I shall dare to say this also, that to have them and always to observe them is harmful, but to appear to have them is useful. To appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but always aware that should you require not to be so, you are able to and can change your position, And you must understand this, that a prince, especially a new one, cannot observe all those qualities for which men are respected, being often forced, for his survival, to act contrary to fidelity, friendship, humanity, and religion. Therefore it is necessary for him to be flexible, according to the winds and the variations of fortune. Yet, as I have said before, he should not diverge from the proper course if he can avoid doing so, but if he must do so, then he has to know how to. For this reason, a prince should take care that he never utters a word that is not compatible with the above-named 5 qualities, that he may appear to be always merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious. It is especially important to appear to have this last quality, since men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because everyone can see you, but few come in close touch with you. Everyone can see what you appear to be, but few really know what you are, and those few dare not oppose the opinions of the majority who have the power of the state to defend them. And in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, whom it is not prudent to challenge, one judges by the result. For that reason, given that a prince gains the credit of conquering and holding his state, his methods will always be considered honourable, and he will be universally praised, because the common sort are always taken in by appearances and by results, and in the world there are only the common people, for the few find a place there only when the many have no ground to rest on. One prince of the present time, whom I had better not name, never preaches anything else but peace and good faith. Yet to both he is most hostile, and if he had kept either, his reputation and kingdom would have been lost many times over.
End of CD 2. CD 3.
19th chapter. The need to avoid being despised and hated. Now, having discussed the more important qualities above, I wish to speak briefly of the others under this heading. The prince must consider, as has been in part said before, how to avoid those things which will make him hated or contemptible, and as long as he is successful, he will have fulfilled his role, and he need not fear any reprisals. It makes him hated above all things, as I have said, to be rapacious and to violate the property and women of his subjects. When neither their property nor honour is touched, the majority live happily, and he has only to contend with the ambition of a few, whom he can deal with easily in a number of ways. It makes him contemptible to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean-spirited, irresolute, all of which a prince should avoid like the plague, and he should try to show in his actions greatness, courage, gravity, and fortitude, and in his private dealings with his people he should show that his judgment is irrevocable, and maintain his reputation so that no one can hope either to deceive him or to get round him. The prince who conveys this impression of himself and who is highly esteemed is not easily conspired against, for provided it is well known that he is an excellent man and revered by his people, he can only be attacked with difficulty. For this reason, a prince should have only 2 fears, one internal from his own subjects, and the other external from foreign powers. From the latter he is defended by being well armed and having good allies, and if he is well armed, he will always have good allies. Domestic affairs will always remain quiet when foreign affairs are quiet, unless they have already been disturbed by conspiracy. And even should affairs abroad be disturbed, provided the prince has carried out his preparations and has lived as I have suggested, and as long as he does not despair, he will resist every attack, just as I said Nabis the Spartan did. But concerning his subjects, when affairs abroad are not disturbed, he has only to fear a conspiracy from within. A prince can easily guard against this by avoiding being hated and despised and by keeping his people satisfied. And one of the most effective remedies that a prince can have against conspiracies is not to be hated and despised by his subjects, for he who plots against a prince must be able to please the people by their prince's removal. But when the conspirator will only succeed in offending the people, he will not have the courage to take such a course, for the difficulties that will confront him are endless. Indeed, experience shows there have been many conspiracies, but few have been successful. For the conspirator cannot act alone, nor can he enlist co-conspirators except from those whom he believes to be dissatisfied. And as soon as you have divulged your intent to a malcontent, you have given him the means with which to blackmail you to his own advantage. Seeing the benefit from this course, and the doubts and dangers of the other, the fellow conspirator must be a very rare friend, or a thoroughly relentless enemy of the prince, to keep faith with you. To put it briefly, I say that on the side of the conspirator there is nothing but fear, jealousy, and the prospect of punishment to terrify him. But on the side of the prince, there is the authority of government, the laws, the protection of friends, and the state to defend him. So, adding to all these things the goodwill of the people, it is impossible that anyone should be so rash as to conspire. For whereas in general the conspirator suffers fear before his plot is carried out, in this case he has also to fear the sequel to the crime, because the people become his enemies, and thus he cannot hope for any escape. I could give endless examples on this subject, but I will be content with just one, which happened within living memory. Messer Annibale Bentivogli, who was prince in Bologna, grandfather of the present Annibale, was murdered by the Caneschi, who had conspired against him. Not one of his family survived except Messer Giovanni, who was a child. Immediately after this assassination, the people rose and murdered all the Caneschi. This sprung from the goodwill of the people, which the house of Bentivogli enjoyed in those days in Bologna. The feeling was so great that although no one remained after the death of Annibale who was able to rule the state, the Bolognese, hearing that one of the Bentivogli family was in Florence, he had up to that time been considered the son of a blacksmith, sent to Florence for him and gave him the government of their city, and he ruled there until Messer Giovanni was old enough to take over. That is why I consider that a prince should pay little heed to conspiracies when his people hold him in high esteem. But when they are hostile to him, he ought to fear everything and everybody. Well-run states and wise princes take care not to drive the nobles to desperation and to keep the people satisfied and contented, for this is one of the most important objectives a prince can have. Among the best ordered and governed kingdoms of our times is France, and in it are found many good institutions on which depend the liberty and safety of the king. Of these, the first is the Parliament and its authority, because the founder of the kingdom, knowing the ambition of the nobility and their boldness, considered that a bit in their mouths would be necessary to restrain them, and, on the other side, knowing the hatred of the people based on their fear of the nobles, he wished to protect them, yet was not anxious for this to be the particular responsibility of the king. Therefore, to absolve himself from the nobles' reproach for favouring the people, and from the people's blame for favouring the nobles, he set up an independent arbiter who could crush the great and favour the weak without reproach on the king. Neither could you have a better or more prudent arrangement, nor a greater sense of security to the king and kingdom. From this one can draw another important conclusion, that princes ought to delegate the responsibility of enacting unpopular measures to others, but grant favours in his own name. And further, I consider that a prince ought to nurture the nobles, but not so much as to make himself hated by the people. It may appear perhaps to some who have examined the lives and deaths of the Roman emperors that many of them are an example which contradicts my theory. Some lived worthy lives and showed great qualities of character. Nevertheless, they lost their empire, or were murdered by their own men who conspired against them. Wishing, therefore, to answer these criticisms, I shall recall the characters of some of the emperors and show that the causes of their ruin were much the same as I suggested. At the same time, I shall only submit for consideration those examples that are well known to students of the period. It seems to me sufficient to take all those emperors who succeeded to the empire, from Marcus the philosopher down to Maximinus. They were Marcus and his son Commodus, Pertinax, Julian, Severus and his son Antoninus Caracalla, Macrinus, Heliogabalus, Alexander, and Maximinus. First, it is important to note that, whereas in other principalities only the ambition of the nobles and the insolence of the people have to be dealt with, the Roman emperors had a third difficulty. They had to contend with the cruelty and avarice of their soldiers, a matter so beset with problems that it was the downfall of many. For it was very hard to give satisfaction both to the soldiers and the people. The people loved peace, and for this reason they loved the unaspiring prince, whilst the soldiers loved the warlike prince who was bold, cruel, and rapacious, and it was these qualities they wanted him to exercise upon the people so that they could get double pay and give vent to their greed and cruelty. The result was that those emperors were always overthrown who, whether by birth or training, had no great authority. And recognizing the difficulty of those two opposing views, most of them, especially those who came new to the principality, were inclined to give in to the demands of the soldiers, caring little about harming the people. This course was necessary because, as princes cannot help being hated by someone, they should in the first place avoid being hated by everyone. When they cannot achieve this, they should use their best endeavours to avoid the hatred of those most powerful. Therefore, those emperors who, through inexperience, needed a special favour, turned more quickly to the soldiers than to the people, a course which turned out advantageous to them or not, depending upon whether the prince knew how to maintain authority over the soldiers. For these reasons, Marcus, Pertinax, and Alexander, men of modest life, lovers of justice, enemies to cruelty, humane and courteous, all came to a sad end, except Marcus. He alone lived and died in high esteem, because he had succeeded to the throne by hereditary title, and owed nothing either to the soldiers or to the people. And afterwards, with his many highly respected qualities, he always kept them both in their places whilst he lived, and was neither hated nor despised. But Pertinax was created emperor against the wish of the soldiers, who, accustomed to a licentious life under Commodus, could not cope with the decent life which Pertinax wished to impose upon them. So, having provided a reason to be hated, to which there was added a contempt for his old age, he was overthrown at the very beginning of his administration. And here it should be noted that hatred is acquired as much by good deeds as by bad ones. Therefore, as I said before, a prince wishing to keep his state is very often forced to do wrong. For when that body of people is corrupt whom you think you need to maintain your position, it may be either the people or the soldiers or the nobles, you have to pander to their demands and humour them, and in that case good deeds will only harm you. But let us come to Alexander, who was a man of such great goodness that, among his other praiseworthy deeds, in the 14 years he reigned, no one was ever put to death by him without trial. Nevertheless, as he was considered to be effeminate and thought to be dominated by his mother, he became despised, and the army rose up against him and murdered him. Turning now to the opposite characters of Commodus, Severus, Antoninus, Caracalla, and Maximinus, you will find them all cruel and rapacious, men who, to satisfy their soldiers, did not hesitate to commit every kind of iniquity against the people. And all, except Severus, came to a bad end. But in Severus there was so much nerve that, although the people were oppressed by him, he kept his soldiers happy and reigned successfully. For his courage made him so much admired in the eyes of the soldiers and the people that the latter were both astonished and awed, and the former respectful and satisfied. And because the deeds of this man as a new prince were so great, I wish to show briefly how well he imitated the fox and the lion, whose natures, as I said earlier, it is essential for a prince to emulate. Knowing the indolence of the Emperor Julian, Severus persuaded the army in Slavonia, of which he was captain, that it would be right to go to Rome and avenge the death of Pertinax, who had been killed by the Praetorian soldiers. Under this pretext, without appearing to aspire to the throne, he moved the army on Rome and reached Italy before it was known that it even started. On his arrival in Rome, the Senate, through fear, elected him emperor and killed Julian. After this, there remained for Severus, who wanted to be master of the whole empire, two obstacles. one in Asia, where Niger, head of the Asiatic army, had proclaimed himself emperor, and the other in the west, where Albinus also aspired to the throne. And as Severus considered it dangerous to declare himself hostile to both, he decided to attack Niger and to deceive Albinus. To the latter he wrote that as emperor elected by the Senate he was willing to share that honour with him and sent him the title of Caesar, and, moreover, told him that the Senate had elected Albinus as his colleague, all of which was accepted by Albinus as true. But after Severus had conquered and killed Niger and pacified the East, he returned to Rome and complained to the Senate that Albinus, failing to recognize the benefits that he had received from him, had by treachery sought to murder him, and for this ingratitude Severus was compelled to punish him. Afterwards he sought him out in France and took from him his power and his life. He who will therefore carefully examine the deeds of this man will find him a most valiant lion and a most cunning fox. He will find him feared and respected by everyone, and not hated by the army. And it need not be wondered at that he, a new prince, was able to hold the empire so well, because his supreme renown always protected him from that hatred which the people might have brought against him for his violence. His son, Antoninus, was a most eminent man, and had very excellent qualities which made him admirable in the eyes of the people and acceptable to the soldiers. For he was a warlike man with considerable energy and a loathing of all delicate food and other luxuries, which won him the devotion of his troops. Despite this, his ferocity and cruelties were so great and so unheard of that, after endless individual murders, he killed a large number of the people of Rome and all the citizens of Alexandria. Antoninus became hated by the whole world, and also feared by those he had around him, to such an extent that he was surrounded by his army and murdered by a centurion. And here it must be noted that such deaths, which are deliberately inflicted with a resolved and desperate courage, cannot be avoided by princes, because anyone who does not fear death can inflict them. But a prince need not fear them so much, because such fanatics are very rare. He has only to be careful not to do any serious harm to those he employs or has around him in the service of the state. Antoninus had not taken this care, but had unceremoniously killed a brother of that centurion, whom he also threatened daily, yet retained in his bodyguard, which, as it turned out, was a reckless thing to do, and proved to be the emperor's downfall. Now let us come to Commodus, for whom it should have been very easy to hold the empire. Being the son of Marcus, he had inherited it, and had only to follow in the footsteps of his father to please both his people and his soldiers. But being by nature cruel and brutal, he abandoned himself to debauching and corrupting the soldiers, so that he might indulge his greed upon the people. Also he failed to maintain his dignity, often descending to the theatre to compete with gladiators and doing other vile acts unworthy of the imperial majesty. So Commodus fell into contempt with his soldiers, and being hated by one party and despised by the other, he was conspired against and killed. It remains to discuss the character of Maximinus. He was a very warlike man, and the armies, being disgusted with the effeminacy of Alexander, of whom I have already spoken, killed him and elected Maximinus to the throne. This he did not possess for long, for two things made him hated and despised. First, he came from humble origins, having once tended sheep in Thrace, which brought him into contempt, it being well known to everyone and considered a great indignity. And secondly, he deferred going to Rome and being formally invested as emperor. He had also gained a reputation for the utmost ferocity by having, through his prefects in Rome and elsewhere in the empire, practised many cruelties, so that the whole world was moved to anger at the lowliness of his birth and to hatred at his barbarity. First Africa rebelled, then the Senate with all the people of Rome, and all Italy conspired against him, as did his own army. This latter, while besieging Aquileia and encountering difficulties in taking it, were so disgusted with his cruelties and fearing him less when they found so many against him, murdered him. I do not wish to discuss Heliogabalus, Macrinus, or Julian, who, being thoroughly contemptible, were quickly wiped out. But I will bring this discourse to an end by saying that modern-day princes are less likely to have this problem of giving inordinate satisfaction to their soldiers because, though one has to give them some indulgence, none of them are experienced in the rule and administration of provinces as were the soldiers of the Roman Empire. And whilst in those times it was more necessary to give satisfaction to the soldiers than to the people, it is now more necessary for all princes, except the Turk and the Sultan ruler of Egypt, to satisfy the people rather than the soldiers, because the people are the more powerful. From the above, I have excluded the Turk, who always keeps round him 12,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry on which depend the security and strength of the kingdom. And putting aside every consideration for the people, he needs to keep the soldiers as his friends. The kingdom of the Sultan is similar, being entirely in the hands of the soldiers. It follows again that he must keep them his friends, without regard to the people. However, you must note that the state of the Sultan is unlike all other principalities. It is like the papacy, which cannot be called either an hereditary or a newly formed principality. It is not the sons of the old prince who become the heirs, but he who is elected to that position by those in authority, and the sons remain only noblemen. And as this is an ancient custom, it cannot be called a new principality, since there are none of the difficulties encountered in new ones. Although the prince is new, the constitution of the state is old, and is framed so as to accept him as if he were the hereditary ruler. But, returning to the subject, I say that those following my argument will acknowledge that either hatred or contempt has brought about the downfall of the above emperors, and it will also be seen how, though some of them acted one way and some another, only one in each way came to a happy end, the rest coming to grief. It would have been useless and dangerous for Pertinax and Alexander, being new princes, to imitate Marcus, who was heir to the principality. Similarly, it would have been utterly destructive for Antoninus, Commodus, and Maximinus to have imitated Severus, as they did not have sufficient courage to follow in his footsteps. Therefore, a prince new to the principality cannot imitate Marcus and does not need to follow Severus, though he should take from Severus those qualities necessary to establish his state, and from Marcus those which are correct and outstanding to maintain an already stable and secure state. 20th chapter. Are fortresses, and many other things to which princes often resort, advantageous or hurtful? 1. Some princes, in order to hold the state securely, have disarmed their subjects. Others have kept their towns distracted by factions. Some have deliberately fostered animosity against themselves. Others have tried to win over those they distrusted before. Some have built fortresses, others have destroyed them. And although one cannot give a final judgment on all of these matters without being in possession of the full facts of each case, nevertheless I will speak as comprehensively as I can on a general basis. 2. No new prince has ever disarmed his subjects. On the contrary, when he has found them unarmed, he has always armed them. By arming them, you arm yourself, and those men who were distrusted become faithful, and those who were faithful remain so, and your subjects become your devotees. And though not all subjects can be armed, those whom you do arm benefit so that the others can be more easily dealt with. This difference in their treatment, which they quite understand, makes dependence of those you arm, and those you do not, realizing that they who have the most danger and responsibility should have the greater reward, excuse you. However, when you disarm the people, you at once offend them by showing that you distrust them either for cowardice or for disloyalty, and either of these opinions breeds hatred against you. And because you need to defend yourself, you turn to mercenaries, whose character I have already discussed. And even if they were good, they would not be enough to defend you against powerful enemies and distrustful subjects. Therefore, as I have said, a new prince and a new principality always arms his subjects. History is full of examples of this. But when a prince acquires a new state which he adds as a province to his old one, then he must disarm all the men of that state except those who have been his supporters in acquiring it. And even these, with time and opportunity, should be rendered weak and ineffectual, and matters must be arranged in such a way that all the armed men in the new state shall be your own soldiers who served close to you in your old state. 3. Our forefathers, and those who were considered wise, were accustomed to say that it was necessary to hold Pistoia by factions and Pisa by fortresses. And with this idea, they fostered strife in some of their subject towns so as to keep possession of them more easily. This may have worked well in those times when Italy was in a way balanced, but I do not believe that it can work today because I do not believe that factions can ever be of use. On the contrary, it is certain that when the enemy attacks you in a divided city, you are quickly defeated because the weakest party will always assist the enemy and the other party will be unable to resist. The Venetians, motivated, I believe, by these reasons, fostered the Guelph and the Ghibelline factions in their subject cities, and although they never allowed them to come to bloodshed, they nonetheless nursed these disputes so that the citizens, distracted by their differences, did not unite against them. As we saw, things did not afterwards turn out as expected, because after the rout at Veia, one party at once took courage and seized the state. These methods argue, therefore, the weakness of the prince, because these factions would never be permitted in a strong principality. Such methods which enable one to manage one's subjects more easily are only useful in times of peace, and if war comes, these policies then prove faulty. 4. Without doubt, princes become great when they overcome the difficulties and obstacles that confront them. Therefore, fortune, especially when she wants to create a new prince who has a greater need to earn renown than a hereditary one, causes enemies to rise up and conspire against him, in order that he might then have the opportunity to overcome them and mount higher as on a ladder raised by his enemies. For this reason, many consider that a wise prince, when he has the opportunity, ought to foster some animosity against himself, so that, having crushed it, his reputation may rise higher. 5. Princes, especially new ones, have found more loyalty and usefulness in those men who in the beginning of their rule were doubted than among those who in the beginning were trusted. Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, ruled his state more with the support of those he had distrusted than of the others. But on this question one cannot speak generally, for it varies so much with the individual. I will only say this, that those men who at the beginning of a princedom have been hostile, if they are of the type to need help in supporting themselves, can always be won over with the greatest ease, and they will resolutely and loyally serve the prince, as they know it to be essential for them to put right the bad impression he had formed of them. So the prince always finds them of more use than those who, feeling too secure in his service, may neglect his affairs. And since it is expedient, I must warn the prince, who by means of special favours has acquired a new state, that he must carefully consider the motives of those who granted these favours, and if it was not out of a natural affection for him, but only out of discontent with their government, then he will find it very difficult to keep them friendly, for it will be impossible to satisfy them. Weighing up the reasons for this in those examples which can be taken from both past and present times, we shall find that it is easier for the prince to make friends of those men who were happy under the former government, and are therefore his enemies, than of those who were discontented with it, and supported and encouraged him to seize it. 6. It has been customary with princes, in order to hold their states more securely, to build fortresses that may serve as a curb on those who might plot against them, and as a place of refuge from a first attack. I praise this system because it has been used for a long time. Notwithstanding that, Messer Niccolò Vitelli, in our own time, has been seen to demolish 2 fortresses in Città de Castello, so that he might keep that state. Guido Urbano, Duke of Urbino, on returning to his dominion whence he had been driven by Cesare Borgia, destroyed all the fortresses in that province and considered that without them it would be more difficult to lose it. The Bentivoglio, returning to Bologna, came to a similar decision. Fortresses, therefore, are useful or not according to circumstances. If they do you good in one way, they harm you in another. And this question can be reasoned as follows. The prince who has more to fear from his people than from outsiders should build fortresses. But he who has more to fear from outsiders than from his people should leave them alone. The castle of Milan, built by Francesco Sforza, has made and will make more trouble for the house of Sforza than any other disturbance in the state. For this reason, the best possible fortress is that you not be hated by the people, because, though you may hold the fortresses, they will not save you if the people hate you. For there will always be outsiders keen to assist a people who have taken up arms against you. It has not been seen in our time that such fortresses have been of much use to any prince, unless to the Countess of Forli, when the Count Girolamo, her consort, was killed. For by means of her fortresses she was able to withstand the popular attack and wait for assistance from Milan, and thus recover her state. The circumstances were such at the time that outsiders were unable to assist the people. But fortresses were of little value to her afterwards, when Cesare Borgia attacked her and when the people, her enemy, joined forces with the invaders. Therefore it would have been safer for her, both then and before, to have been friendly with her people and dispensed with the fortresses. All these things considered, then, I shall praise those who build fortresses as well as those who do not. But I shall blame those who, putting their trust in their fortresses, do not care if they are hated by the people. 21st chapter. How a prince should conduct himself so as to gain renown. Nothing makes a prince so much esteemed as great deeds and setting a fine example. We have in our own time Ferdinand of Aragon, the present King of Spain. He can almost be called a new prince, because he has risen by fame and glory from an insignificant king to the foremost king in Christendom. And if you consider his deeds, you will find all of them great and some of them quite extraordinary. In the beginning of his reign he attacked Granada, and this campaign was the foundation of his dominions. He did this quietly at first and without any fear of hindrance, for he kept the minds of the barons of Castile occupied with the war, and not anticipating any innovations. Thus they did not realize that by these means he was acquiring power and authority over them. With money from the church and from the people, he was able to sustain his armies and, during that long war, to lay the foundation of the military skill for which he has become famous. Further, always using religion as a pretext so as to undertake even greater campaigns, he devoted himself with a pious cruelty to driving out and clearing his kingdom of the Moors. Nor could there be a more striking example, nor one more rare. Under the same pretext he assailed Africa, he invaded Italy, and he has finally attacked France. So his achievements and plans have always been great, and have kept the minds of his people occupied in suspense and admiration. And his actions have arisen in such a way, one followed closely by the other, that men have never had the time to plot against him. Again, it greatly helps a prince to set unusual examples in internal affairs similar to those attributed to Messer Bernabo da Milano, who, if anyone in civil life did something extraordinary, either good or bad, would use some method of rewarding or punishing him which would get everyone talking, and a prince should always, above everything, endeavour to get himself the reputation of being a great and remarkable man. A prince is also much respected when he is either a true friend or a downright enemy. In other words, when he declares himself without any reservation in favour of one party against the other. This will always be more favourable than remaining neutral. In the first case, when you have two powerful neighbours who are of such a character that should they come to blows you might be in danger from the victor, it will always be more advantageous to you to declare yourself one way or the other and join the battle. Because if you do not declare yourself, you will invariably fall prey to the conqueror, to the pleasure and satisfaction of the vanquished, and you will have no excuse nor anything to protect you. For the victor does not want dubious friends who will not help him in a crisis, and the vanquished will not offer you protection because you did not willingly take their side during the war. Antiochus went into Greece because he was asked by the Aetolians to drive out the Romans. He sent envoys to the Achaeans who were friends of the Romans, exhorting them to remain neutral, but the Romans urged them to take up arms on their own behalf. This question came to be discussed in the council of the Achaeans, where Antiochus's legate urged them to stand neutral. To this, the Roman legate answered, "As for what has been said, that it is better and more advantageous for your state not to interfere in our war, nothing could be further from the truth, because by your not interfering you will be left, without favour or consideration, the victor's prize." So it will always happen that he who is not your friend will demand your neutrality, whilst he who is your friend will entreat you to take up arms on his behalf. And irresolute princes, to avoid immediate dangers, generally follow the neutral path and are generally ruined. But when a prince declares himself in favour of one side and the party with whom he allies himself conquers, the victor may be all-powerful and have him at his mercy, but he is also indebted to him, and a bond of friendship is established, and men are never quite so shameless that they would show ingratitude by oppressing you afterwards. Victories, after all, are never so complete that the victor must not show some regard for law and justice. But if he with whom you ally yourself loses, you may be protected by him, and whilst he can, he may help you, and you can work in partnership to improve your respective fortunes. In the second case, when those who fight are of such a character that you have no fear as to who may conquer, it is even more important to be allied to the one side or the other, because you assist in the destruction of one with the help of the other, who, had he been wise, would have saved him instead. And since the conqueror, with your assistance, cannot fail to succeed, he remains at your mercy. And here it must be noted that a prince should never make an alliance with one more powerful than himself in order to attack others, unless necessity compels him, as described. Because if he conquers, you are at his mercy, and princes should avoid as much as possible being at the mercy of anyone. The Venetians joined with France against the Duke of Milan, and this alliance, which caused the ruin of the Venetians, could have been avoided. But when it cannot be avoided, as happened to the Florentines when the Pope and Spain sent armies to attack Lombardy, then, for the above reasons, the prince should favour one of the parties. Never let any government imagine that it can choose perfectly safe courses. Rather let it expect to have to take very risky ones, because it is usual that one seldom avoids one trouble without running into another. But wisdom consists in knowing how to distinguish the nature of the troubles and then choosing the lesser evil. A prince ought also to recognize ability and to honor those proficient in every art and trade. At the same time, he should encourage his citizens to practice their occupations peaceably, both in commerce and agriculture and in every other employment, so that they should not be deterred either from improving their possessions for fear that they be taken away, or for starting up business for fear of taxes. Instead, the prince ought to offer incentives to those wanting to do these things and to anyone who strives to increase the prosperity of the city or state. Further, he ought to entertain the people with festivals and spectacles at convenient seasons of the year, and as every city is divided into guilds or family groups, he ought to hold them in high regard and associate with them sometimes, and show himself an example of courtesy and liberality, nevertheless always maintaining the dignity of his rank, for this must never be devalued. 22nd chapter. Concerning the secretaries of princes. The choice of his staff is of no little importance to a prince, and they reflect upon the judgment of the prince. The first impression one forms of a prince and of his thinking is by observing the people he has around him, and when they are capable and faithful, he is considered wise, because he has known how to recognize talented people and to retain their loyalty. But when they are otherwise, it is impossible to form a good opinion of him, for in choosing them he has made a grave error of judgment. There were none who knew Messer Antonio da Venafro as the servant of Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, who would not consider Pandolfo to be a very clever man in having appointed Venafro his servant, because there are three classes of intellects, one which comprehends by itself, another which appreciates what others comprehend, and a third which neither comprehends by itself nor learns from others. The first is excellent, the second is good, and the third is useless. Therefore it follows that if Pandolfo was not in the first rank, he was certainly in the second. For if one has the judgment to know good or bad in other people, despite the fact that he himself may not have the initiative, he can recognize the good and the bad in his servant, and he can then praise one and correct the other. Thus the servant cannot hope to deceive him, and is kept honest. But to enable a prince to form an opinion of his servant, there is one test which never fails. When you see the servant acting more in his own interest than yours, and seeking profit for himself in everything, such a man will never make a good servant, nor will you ever be able to trust him, because he who has the affairs of another in his hands should never think of himself but always of his prince, and never pay attention to matters with which the prince is not concerned. On the other hand, to retain his servant's loyalty, the prince ought to honour him, reward him well, do him kindnesses, share with him both the honours and the responsibilities. At the same time, let him see that he is dependent upon his master, so that his many honours may not make him seek more, nor his new wealth make him greedy, and let him see that his many burdens may wreak dreadful changes. When, therefore, a prince's relations with his servants are thus arranged, they can trust each other. But when it is otherwise, the end will always be disastrous for one or the other. 23rd chapter. How flatterers should be avoided. I do not wish to leave out an important part of this subject, for it is a danger from which princes are protected with difficulty unless they are very careful and discriminating. I speak of flatterers, of whom the courts are full, because men are so self-absorbed in their own affairs, and in a way so deceived in them, that they are easy prey to this pest, and if they try to defend themselves, they run the risk of being despised. As there is no other way of guarding oneself from flatterers, except by letting men understand that the truth does not offend you, but if everyone feels able to tell you the truth, you lose their respect. Therefore a wise prince holds a third course by choosing the wise men in his state and giving them only the liberty of plain speaking, and then only of those things of which he inquires, and nothing else. But he should question them about everything, and listen to their opinions, and afterwards form his own conclusions. With these counsellors, separately and collectively, he should make each of them understand that the more freely he speaks, the more he shall be preferred. Other than these counsellors, the prince should listen to no one, pursue the matter concerned, and be steadfast in his resolutions. He who does otherwise is either overthrown by flatterers, or is so often changing his mind due to the conflicting advice that he falls into disrepute. I wish on this subject to cite as an example Fra Luca, the secretary of Maximilian, the present emperor. Speaking of his majesty, he said, he consulted with no one, yet never got his own way in anything. This arose because of his following the opposite practice to the above, for the emperor is a secretive man. He does not divulge his plans to anyone, nor does he ask for opinions on them. But when they are put into effect and thus revealed, they are at once obstructed by those around him, and he, being pliable, changes his mind about them. Hence it follows that those things he does one day he changes the next, and no one ever understands what he wishes or intends to do, and no one can rely on his decisions. A prince, therefore, ought always to take advice, but only when he wishes and not when others wish. He should rather discourage everyone from offering advice unless he asks for it. But he should be a constant inquirer and a patient listener concerning those matters about which he inquired. Also, if he discovers that anyone, for any reason, has not told him the truth, he should let his anger be felt. And if there are some who think that a prince who gives an impression of wisdom not by virtue of his own ability, but due to the good advisers around him, they are deceived, because there is an axiom which never fails. A prince who is not wise himself will never take good advice, unless by chance he has put his affairs entirely into the hands of one person who happens to be a very shrewd man. In this case, indeed, he may be well governed, but it would not be for long, because such a shrewd man would in a short time overthrow him. But if an inexperienced prince should take advice from more than one, he will never get a unanimous counsel, nor will he know how to achieve this. Each of the counsellors will think of his own personal interests, and the prince will not know how to control them nor see through them. And they will not be found otherwise, because men are always untrue to you unless they are kept honest by constraint. Therefore, it is inferred that good advice, wherever it comes from, is due to the wisdom of the prince, and not the wisdom of the prince due to the good advice. 24th chapter. Why the princes of Italy have lost their states. The previous suggestions, if carefully observed, will enable a new prince to appear to be well established and make him at once more secure and solid in government than if he had ruled for a long time. For the actions of a new prince are more closely observed than those of a hereditary one, and as soon as they are seen to be successful, they attract more men and establish a group even tighter knit than family. Because men are impressed more by the present than the past, and when they find the present good, they make the most of it and look no further. They will also make the best protection for a prince, provided he does not fail them in other things. So it will be a double honour to him to have established a new principality, and adorned and strengthened it with good laws, good forces, good allies, and by a good example. Likewise, it will be a double disgrace to a hereditary prince who loses his state through lack of wisdom. If we consider those princes who have lost their states in Italy in our times, such as the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and others, there will be found in them, firstly, one common defect in regard to arms for the reasons which I have discussed at length. Secondly, some of them will have had to contend with hostile subjects, or if his subjects were friendly, he has then not known how to secure the loyalty of his nobles. Without these weaknesses, states with the power to keep an army in the field cannot be defeated. Philip of Macedon, not the father of Alexander the Great, but the man who was conquered by Titus Quintius, had not much territory compared to the greatness of the Romans and the Greeks who attacked him, but being a warlike man who knew how to win over the people and secure the nobles' loyalty, sustained the war against his enemies for many years, and if in the end he lost some of his cities, he nevertheless retained his kingdom. Therefore, our princes cannot blame bad luck for the loss of their principalities after so many years in possession, but rather their own indolence, because in quiet times they thought they would continue forever. It is a common defect in man not to make any provision in the calm against the storm. And when afterwards the bad times arrive, they think of fleeing, and not of defending themselves, and they hope that the people, disgusted with the behaviour of the victors, will reinstate them. This course, when others fail, may be good, but it is very bad to neglect all other possibilities, since you should not fail simply in the hope that you might find someone later who will restore you. This is unlikely to happen, and if it does, you will not be safe, because that restoration is of no use if it does not depend upon yourself. Only a course that is brought by yourself and your courage will be reliable, certain, and durable. 25th chapter. What fate can effect in human affairs, and how to withstand her? I am aware that many men have had and still have the opinion that the affairs of the world are in the hands of fate and of God, and that men with their knowledge cannot guide them, nor indeed can anyone even help them, and because of this they would have us believe that it is not necessary to make an effort in affairs of state, but to let chance govern them. This opinion has gained weight in recent times because of the great changes which have been seen, and may still be seen every day, beyond all human imagination. Sometimes, pondering over this, I am in some degree inclined to their opinion. Nevertheless, one should not rule out our free will. I hold it to be true that fate is the arbiter of half our actions, but that she still leaves us to control the other half, or perhaps a little less. I can compare fate to one of those raging rivers which, when in flood, overflows the plains, sweeping away trees and buildings, washing the soil from one place to another. Everything flees before it, all yield to its violence, without being able in any way to withstand it. And yet, though its nature be such, it does not follow, therefore, that men, when the weather becomes fair, cannot make provision, both with defences and barriers, so that, rising again, the waters will pass aside via a canal, and their force will be less unrestrained and less dangerous. So it happens with fate, who shows her power where she encounters no resistance, and turns her force when she knows there are no barriers or defences to constrain her. And if you consider Italy, which is the seat of these changes, and which has given them their impetus, you will see it to be an open land without barriers and without any defence. For if it had been defended in a proper manner, as are Germany, Spain, and France, either the flood would have made no great changes, or it would not have come at all. And this I consider enough to say about resistance to fate in general. But confining myself more to particular situations, a prince may be happy one day and ruined the next without showing any change of attitude or character. This, I believe, arises firstly from causes that have already been discussed at length, namely that the prince who relies entirely upon fate is lost when it goes against him. I also believe that he who adapts his policies to suit the times will succeed, and he who does not will fail. Men are seen to use various methods in pursuit of the ambition that everyone has before him, namely glory and riches. Some proceed with caution, some with haste, some by force, others by skill, some by patience, others by its opposite, and each one succeeds in reaching their goal by a different course. One can also see cases where, of two cautious men, one achieves his goal and the other fails, and similarly, two men from different perspectives are equally successful, the one being cautious, the other impetuous. And this arises from nothing else but whether or not they adapt their policies to suit the times. This follows from what I said. Two men working differently can bring about the same effect, and conversely, of two working similarly, one will attain his objective and the other will not. Changes in prosperity also result from this. If time and events converge in such a way that he who governs himself with caution and patience is successful, his fortune is made. But if times and events change, he is ruined if he does not modify his course of action. But it is rare to find a man sufficiently circumspect to know how to adapt himself to change, partly because he cannot deviate from his natural inclinations, and partly because, having always prospered by acting in one way, he cannot be persuaded to abandon it. And therefore the cautious man, when it is time to become adventurous, does not know how to do so, hence he is ruined. But had he changed with the times, his fortune would not have changed. Pope Julius II was impetuous in all his affairs, but found that time and circumstances so suited his line of action that he always met with success. Consider his first campaign against Bologna, when Giovanni Bentivogli was still alive. The Venetians did not agree to it, nor did the King of Spain, and Julius was still discussing it with the King of France. Nevertheless, he personally embarked upon the expedition with his accustomed boldness and energy, a move which made Spain and the Venetians stand irresolute and passive, the latter from fear, the former from a desire to recover the kingdom of Naples. On the other hand, Pope Julius took with him the King of France because, having observed the events and desiring to make the Pope his friend in order to humble the Venetians, the king found it impossible to refuse him soldiers without manifestly offending him. Therefore, Julius, with his impetuous action, accomplished what no other pope with simple human wisdom could have done. For if he had waited in Rome until he could get away with his plans arranged and everything fixed, as any other pope would have done, he would never have succeeded, because the King of France would have made 1,000 excuses, and the others would have raised 1,000 fears. I will leave his other actions alone. They were all similar, and they all succeeded, for the brevity of his life did not allow him to experience failure. But if circumstances had arisen which required him to go cautiously, his ruin would have followed, because he could never have deviated from his natural inclinations. Luck is changeable, whereas mankind is resolute in his ways. I conclude, therefore, that when the two are in agreement, men will succeed, and when the two diverge, men will fail. For my part, I consider that it is better to be adventurous than cautious, because fate is a woman, and if you wish to keep her, it is necessary to beat and misuse her. And it is noted that she allows herself to be mastered by the adventurous rather than by those who are more cautious. She is therefore always, like a woman, a lover of young men, because they are less cautious, more violent, and, with more audacity, command her. 26th chapter. An exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians. Having carefully considered the matter just discussed, I have been wondering within myself whether the present times are propitious for a new prince, and whether the elements are present that would give the opportunity for a wise and capable man to introduce a new order which would bring both honour to him and good to the people of his country. It appears to me that there are so many ingredients favourable to a new prince that I never knew a time more suitable than the present. And if, as I said, it was necessary that the people of Israel should be held in captivity in order that Moses should emerge, that the Persians should be oppressed by the Medes so as to discover the greatness of Cyrus, and that the Athenians should be dispersed to bring to light the capabilities of Theseus, then at the present time, in order to discover the true value of an Italian soul, it was necessary that Italy should be reduced to the extremity she is now in. She has become more enslaved than the Hebrews, and more oppressed than the Athenians, without head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, overrun. She has endured every kind of desolation. Although lately some spark may have been shown by one which made us think he was ordained by God to redeem our country, nevertheless it was afterwards seen at the peak of his career that fate rejected him. So Italy, left lifeless, awaits for him who shall yet heal her wounds and put an end to the ravaging and plundering of Lombardy, to the swindling and taxing of the kingdom and of Tuscany, and to erase the cancer that has for so long festered. It is seen how Italy entreats God to send someone who shall deliver her from these wrongs and barbarous insolencies. It is seen also that she is ready and willing to follow a banner if only someone will raise it. Nor is there to be seen at present one in whom she can place more hope than in your illustrious house, with its valour and fortune, favoured by God and by the Church of which it is now the chief, and which could redeem Italy. This will not be difficult, if you remind yourself of the actions and lives of the men I have named. And although they were great and wonderful men, they were mere mortals, and each one of them had no more opportunity than is offered now. Their enterprise was neither more just nor easier, nor was God more their friend than he is yours. In our cause there is great justice, because a necessary war is a just war, and arms are holy when they are the last resort. Here there is the greatest enthusiasm, and where there is enthusiasm, the difficulties will be overcome if you will only follow those whom I have singled out. Furthermore, how extraordinary are the ways of God that have manifested themselves beyond example. The sea is divided, A cloud has led the way. A rock has gushed water. It has rained manna. Everything has contributed to your greatness. You must do the rest. God is not willing to do everything, and in so doing take away our free will and that share of glory which belongs to us. And it is not surprising if none of the above-named Italians have been able to accomplish all that is expected from your illustrious house, and if, in so many revolutions in Italy and in so many campaigns, it has always appeared as if our military prowess were exhausted, this has happened because the old system was not good, and none of us have known how to find a new one. And nothing honours a man more than to establish new laws and new ordinances when he himself is newly risen. Such things, if well-founded and dignified, will make him revered and admired, and in Italy there are many opportunities to bring about such a reorganization. Here there is great valour in the Indians, though it is lacking amongst the chiefs. Look closely at the duels and the hand-to-hand combats, how superior the Italians are in strength, dexterity, and subtlety. But when it comes to armies, they do not bear comparison, and this springs entirely from the lack of good leaders, since those who are capable are not obedient. Each one seems to know his own level, there having never been anyone distinguished enough above the rest, either by valour or fortune, that others would submit to him. Hence, for so long, and during so much fighting in the past 20 years, whenever there has been an army entirely Italian, it has always given a poor account of itself. The first witness to this, Il Taro, then Alessandria, Capua, Genoa, Vaia, Bologna, Mestre. If, therefore, your illustrious house wishes to follow those remarkable men who have redeemed their country, it is necessary, before all things, as a true foundation for every enterprise, to be provided with your own forces, because there can be no more faithful, truer, or better soldiers. And although on their own they are good, together they will be even better, especially when they find themselves commanded by their prince, honoured by him, and maintained at his expense. Therefore it is necessary to be prepared with such arms, so that you can be defended against foreigners by Italian might. And although Swiss and Spanish infantry may be considered very formidable, nevertheless they both have a defect, with the result that a third army would not only be able to fight them, but could also be relied upon to overthrow them. For the Spaniards cannot resist cavalry, and the Swiss are afraid of infantry whenever they encounter them in close combat. Because of this, as we have seen before and will see again, the Spaniards are unable to resist the French cavalry, and the Swiss are overcome by the Spanish infantry. And although a complete proof of this latter theory cannot be shown, nevertheless there was some evidence of it at the Battle of Ravenna, when the Spanish infantry were confronted by German battalions, who followed the same tactics as the Swiss, when the Spaniards, through their physical agility, and with the aid of shields, got in under the pikes of the Germans and stood out of danger, able to attack. The Germans stood helpless, and if the cavalry had not arrived, all would have been lost. It is possible, therefore, knowing the defects of both these types of infantries, to form a new one which will resist the cavalry and not fear the infantry. This need not mean the creation of a new army, but a variation upon the old, and these are the kind of improvements which confer reputation and power upon a new prince. This opportunity must not be allowed to pass for letting Italy at last see her liberator. Nor is it possible to express the love with which he would be received in all those provinces which have suffered so much from these foreign incursions, with what thirst for revenge, with what stubborn faith, with what devotion, with what tears. What door would be closed to him? Who would refuse obedience to him? What envy would hinder him? What Italian would refuse him homage? To all of us, this barbarous government stinks. Let therefore your illustrious house take up this charge with the courage and hope
with which all just enterprises are undertaken, so that under its auspices our native country may be elevated, and under its authority may be verified that saying of Petrarch, "Virtue gainst fury shall advance the fight, and it to the combat soon shall put to flight, for the old Roman valour is not dead, nor in the Italians' breasts extinguished."